Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Valley Where Dead Men Live by Harold Ward. Chapter 1. I have passed through the valley where dead men live. My eyes have looked upon sights which God did not intend that man should see. My life must pay the forfeit. As a man of science, you may be interested in hearing what I have to say, and I must unburden myself to someone before I pass out into the great unknown. But 5 days have passed since I said goodbye to old Sourdough Jameson. It seems as many centuries. Professor Parmalee gave the speaker a quick glance. Did I understand you to say that you left Jameson's 5 days ago? Are you sure about that? The man on the cot nodded. On the 20th of June, to be exact. There is no possibility of your being mistaken. None whatever. My diary will prove it. I made my last entry the night before I left Sourdough's place, on the 19th. The professor sat silent for a second. There is something wrong with your story, Blake. The nearest route over the mountains from here is by way of Chattahoochee Pass, which would make the distance from this point to Sourdough Jameson's cabin a matter of over 150 miles. This is the 25th of June. A well man couldn't do it. It is an impossibility for you to have made it in 5 days in your weakened condition. Not that I wish to dispute your word, but... The sick man smiled wanly. Don't you see, Professor, that your own statement helps to support my story? I tell you that I wandered into an undiscovered route through the mountains. You say that you picked me up half an hour ago, lying exhausted and unconscious a few rods from your camp. That being the case, the entrance to the valley where dead men live, on this side of the range, must be near at hand. You'll say I'm crazy when I tell you that I have seen living dead men who do not know that they are dead. Can you imagine it? No. Neither could I if I had not seen it myself. I've been through the valley of the living dead and came out alive. I've seen them, living dead men, by the millions and millions, fighting, stabbing, shooting, tearing at each other's throats like maddened beasts. And beasts they are, maddened by blood. Blood flows in rivers in the valley where the dead men live. It's the rage they were in when they died. They carried it on with them beyond the grave, and they're fighting it out in there. Can't you hear the rumble of cannon? Listen. You think that it's thunder, but it's not. And those flashes that you notice just over the brow of the mountain, the flashes of the big guns, man, spirit guns. No. It's not lightning. I'm telling you the truth. I know that you think I'm insane. I don't blame you. He stopped suddenly, his nostrils dilating. Take a whiff of that breeze, Professor. Don't you smell anything? Parmalee sniffed. The air from the mountains does have a peculiar acrid odor. It's reminiscent of something. Gunpowder. By George, that's what it is. Somebody must have fired a weapon close at hand. And yet, why didn't we hear the report? The scientist gazed out of the tent door. It was none of my party. They are all accounted for. Yet I could have sworn that there was not another human being within 50 miles. Blake smiled again. I merely called it to your attention, Professor, so that you would give more credence to my story. It is so strange, this story of the living dead, that it will stretch your imagination to the utmost. I am a sick man. I doubt if I survive the day. You, as a scientific man, may be able to discover the solution of the puzzle. Perhaps you may even be able to do something to help release those poor devils in there from the tie of hatred that is binding them to this earth. At any rate, I would like to tell you my yarn if you care to listen. Just give me another sip of that moose broth, will you? Raising the sick man's head, Professor Parmalee fed him a small quantity of the warm soup. Then he sat down again beside the cot in an attitude of attention. Chapter 2. "You are going to put me down as the greatest liar since the world began," Blake said wearily. "Yet every word that I tell you is the absolute truth. My mind was never clearer than at the present time, so don't think that what I say to you is the raving of a disordered brain either. You have heard the theory advanced by believers in spiritualism that some people who die suddenly persist in keeping in touch with the earth, while others go directly on to their reward. I have seen enough to prove, but I digress. My time is short. Let me start at the beginning. When the war broke out, I attempted to enlist, but was rejected on account of my physical condition. Nerves. But I finally succeeded in hooking up with the Red Cross and got over. I was gassed and later got a dose of shell shock. You know what that means? Nerves, pure and simple. It is needless to tell you that I suffered all of the torments of hell. So we'll pass that up and go on. I landed in the states of physical wreck. The doctors sent me to the mountains. I am a wealthy man, but it suited my mood to travel light and alone. I wandered here and there until I finally reached this North Country. I studied geology once, and while I don't need the money, I decided to do a little prospecting. A week or so ago, I reached the cabin of Sourdough Jameson, having canoed up the river nearly 200 miles. I remained with the old man 3 days, resting up, then announced my intention of striking out directly into the mountains. Jameson tried his best to dissuade me. He claimed that the Indians had a legend that there was a valley located somewhere in the middle of the range which was the abiding place of spirits. The valley where dead men live, they called it, and that nobody who entered it ever came back alive. I've been through it and I'm out of it, but I'm no better than a dead man, so the old legend holds good. But I hope when I do pass out that my soul can rest in peace. God, I don't want to spend an eternity in that hellhole back yonder. I will not bore you with the details of my trip up the mountains, for I started early next morning in spite of Jameson's objections. That night I camped halfway up the side of the range. Next morning, that would be 4 days ago, I chanced upon a little canyon that wound in and out among the rocks. There were signs of gold, and I determined to explore it thoroughly before going further. As I continued, the air grew colder. From somewhere ahead came a dull, indescribable roar. I put it down to a waterfall somewhere in the distance. Suddenly, after a 2 hours tramp, I reached the end of the narrow pathway and found myself on the edge of a steep decline, ice-covered, slippery, a veritable man-trap, which seemed to surround a huge, deep basin. The entire place was buried under a pall of smoke which hid everything from view. On all sides rose the mountains, rugged, their peaks covered with snow, offering an impassable barrier. The path by which I had entered seemed to be the only means of getting in or out. Out of the basin, there came to my ears a steady, rumbling booming. The air was filled with it. The earth seemed to tremble under my feet at frequent intervals. Sometimes the noise would die out for a second, only to start again with renewed violence. There was nothing to be frightened at, yet I confess that the goose pimples came to the surface, and I felt the icy chills run up and down my spine. My hair stood up like the quills of a porcupine. The very atmosphere seemed filled with despair, with a vague something the human mind could not grasp. Suddenly the wind brought to my ears a shout. Then came the shrill, piercing, agonized scream of a woman, a shriek that was filled with terror and helplessness. Again and again it assailed my ears. Shouting in answer, I ran along the edge of the precipice, looking for a pathway that would lead me to the rescue of her who called. As I ran along the narrow shelf of ice, I threw off my heavy pack and carried only my rifle. Then I slipped and lost my footing. My gun flew from my grasp. I struggled to save myself, but without avail. Over the slippery edge I slid, down, down, down. It seemed to me that I rolled for miles. There was absolutely nothing which I could grasp to stop my wild plunge. Nothing but ice, 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 cold and smooth as glass. Faster and faster I went, until my speed was that of an express train. I almost lost consciousness. I could not think. Suddenly I struck the bottom with a force that knocked me senseless. Chapter 3. I was awakened from my stupor by a peculiar rat-tat-tat that sounded like the rattle of a drum. I opened my eyes. The air was filled with acrid smoke. It hung over me like a great grey blanket. Was I dead? I raised myself on my elbows and looked about me. For an instant I imagined that I was back in Flanders. Then I remembered my fall. But where was I? The ground was covered with bodies, heaped up in grotesque attitudes, lying in odd-shaped piles. It was a veritable charnel house, a page torn from Dante's Inferno. And such bodies, peculiar, transparent, crystalline. I could see through them as one looks through heavy plate glass. Heavens! It was horrible, hideous. And blood. Blood everywhere. The air rang with shrieks and groans and laughter, wild, haunting laughter that froze the marrow in my bones. Close beside me, a machine gun was rattling, served by a sergeant and 2 privates wearing olive drab. All 3 were of the same peculiar greyish cast of pellucidness as were the bodies lying around. On all sides guns were booming. The ground rocked beneath them. Was I dreaming? Was I the victim of a horrible nightmare in which my subconscious mind was again living the scenes I had gone through across the seas? I pinched myself to make sure. I was at a loss for an explanation. I shook like an aspen leaf. I was filled with supernatural terror. Then something happened that gave me a better light on the matter. Just at my right was a small knoll, scarred and pitted with machine gun nests. Through the drab, smoky haze, I could see the ill-fitting German uniforms on the men who manned them. Across the gap that separated them from me, a man was crawling, dragging himself along on hands and knees. He turned his head toward me for an instant. I recognized Howard Preston, an old friend, a captain of infantry who had been killed in the Argonne after silencing a number of German guns that had stopped the American advance. Did he still live? But no. I had seen his body the day it was buried. Was I crazy? My head whirled. I was unable to move, so transfixed was I by what was going on around me. Suddenly I saw Preston leap forward. A dozen guns opened on him. Yet they failed to stop him. I saw him fire from the hip. Then he leaped among the Germans with the butt end of his rifle. A second later he hurled the weapon aside and, drawing his automatic from its holster, sprang into a second nest. The man seemed to bear a charmed life. The Germans swarmed over him time after time, but after each effort he emerged triumphant. His clothes hung on him in tatters. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His face was a red smear through which his eyes gleamed like burning coals. A German officer, a great hulking blond man, fired a pistol point blank at him. It failed to stop his rush. Both reached for their trench knives. They came together, locked in a death struggle, their weapons plying like mad. Slowly, the German dropped to the ground, a peculiar dazed look on his flat, round face. Preston turned wearily away and beckoned, as if waving for his men to move forward. Then he crumpled up and fell forward across his victim's body. Then I knew the truth, the horrible truth. The legend of the Indians was not fiction. This was the valley where dead men lived. Here men, who could not break their earthly ties, came back to fight on and on until their berserker rage had expended itself. Here they were enacting over and over again the final tragedy of their lives. God. It was the most diabolical thing that the human mind could imagine. Think of it. All over that vast plain, in the midst of that ice-bound valley, similar tragedies were being enacted by men, dead men. Wraiths were grappling here, there, and everywhere. The peculiar feature of it all was that I seemed to be able to see each individual feat of valor at the same time. although they were transpiring over miles of territory. It was like looking at an immense moving picture that unreeled itself before me. I can liken it to nothing better than one of the huge, old-fashioned panoramas that were in vogue a few years after the Civil War, some few of which still remain in southern cities. I seemed to be floating over the entire basin. The guns seemed to be real guns, shooting real bullets. The cannon were the monsters of steel that I had seen in France. Yet I swear several times I passed directly through barrages unscathed. The weapons, like the men who served them, were only phantoms. God in heaven! It was the most horrible scene of carnage I have ever witnessed, more awful than the hell of France and Belgium, for every detail was the result of the terrible ire under which the combatants labored when they met their death. As fast as they had played their parts, they started in at the beginning and went through it again and again, over and over, like automatons, held to their posts by a divine decree of some kind. Words fail me. It was so unspeakably ghastly, weird, a futurist nightmare, a bedlam of noise and confusion, a kaleidoscopic phantasmagoria of light and color. Death walked everywhere. Remember, Professor, on a battlefield, the men do not die in great numbers and lie around in heaps. Hours, days, sometimes weeks, pass without carnage. Even in the heat of conflict, only a small percentage of those engaged meet death. Here it was different. For miles in every direction there was death, death, death. Nothing but cold, stark death, death and blood. Explain? I can't. My idea is, as I stated before, that man must work out his own salvation, that those who died in the heat of anger must work that hatred off before their spirits can quit this earth. God, in his infinity wisdom, did not care to inflict the horror upon the entire world, so he set aside this barren hole as a place where dead men might sever the ties that bind them here, and with their passion cooled, pass on to a better life. No, the man never lived who could describe it, that cold, ice-bound hell. The air tingled with madness, and the look of awful malignancy on the faces of those poor souls as they went on and on through the same monotonous performance of killing and being killed. It was butchery. The place was a slaughterhouse. Ah, the deeds of valor that I saw performed. Wonderful. Magnificent. History will never be able to record the actual happenings, the cold-blooded bravery. Through the hazy heavens, phantom aeroplanes manned by ghostly pilots dipped and maneuvered, dodging, falling to the earth in tangled masses, often burning. Gigantic balloons in flames tossed amidst the clouds. Among a heap of stones, the remains of what had once been a tiny church located in the center of an ancient graveyard. A sniper carried on his nefarious trade, his hiding place a tomb from which the bodies had been hurled aside. I saw a group approach the place, grim determination written on their faces. Their beloved colonel had been a victim of the sniper's bullets. They found him after a long search. A youngster, he had been the colonel's orderly, leaped upon him. A knife plunged up, down, slowly, monotonously, while the screams of him into whose body it was sinking made the night hideous. And when he had completed his work on that dead thing with the glassy eyes that gazed upward unseeingly, the youngster calmly wiped his weapon upon the tunic of the vanquished foe. Oh, the look of vengeance that was upon the countenances of that little group! A shell came screaming through the heavens. They attempted to dodge to cover, but too late. And so the awful drama went on and on. There is no rest for those who dwell in the valley where dead men live. Men fought with the ferocity of wild beasts. They were blood-mad, frenzied. A little detachment of Englishmen was laboring with automatic rifles just at the edge of a wood. In front of them was a tiny vale through which wound a sunken road. On the opposite side of the valley was another thicket in which was a seemingly equal number of Germans. It was a duel to the death between the two groups. Both seemed to exhaust their ammunition at the same time. By what appeared to be mutual consent, they left their guns and charged at each other, meeting in the middle of that once peaceful little dell. There were not over 20 men on either side. Grappling, they fought hand to hand, using knives, clubs, stones, their revolvers, their bare hands. They were like cave dwellers, giving no quarter and asking none. At the end, there was no one left on either side, only a heap of dead and dying. When it was all over, the dead arose and again went through the monotonous performance. Chapter 4. I was hypnotized, held by a spell I could not break. Try as I would, I seemed unable to drag myself away from the ghastly sights. I don't know how long I remained in the Valley of Horrors. You say it was 4 days. Look at my hair, Snow White. When I left Sourdough's cabin, my locks were dark. I am just past 30 years of age. Yet, from my appearance, one would swear that I had passed the 60 years and 10 allotted to man. I have not slept, for the hellish panorama continued on and on and on. Only at night, a different group of actors filled the stage. The darkness was hideous with the roar of the big guns and the screech of shells. Signal rockets filled the air. As if by magic, trenches appeared here and there, little sectors, each with its own melancholy drama of life and death. Here was a stretch of no man's land with its grisly tenants. Men hung on barbed wire entanglements, their clothes in tatters, swaying to and fro in the breeze like scarecrows in a farmer's field. Often I lost consciousness. I fainted, I suppose. Much of the time I wandered about in a daze. I knew not which way to turn. Dead men, living dead men, everywhere. I dragged myself into a tiny house that seemed to stand in the center of the valley. It was empty. I threw myself on the floor, thinking to gain a minute's respite from the horrors around me. I dropped into a deep sleep. I was awakened by the sound of voices. I crouched farther back in the darkness of the corner, frightened, not daring to make a move. What was I afraid of? I do not know. One need not fear specters, need he? There was a sound of a match being struck, and then a candle flared up. By its uncertain light, I made out the figures of 2 men wearing German uniforms. They groped about until they found a trap door cut in the floor. Raising it, they lowered themselves through the opening. Seized by some impulse which even now I am unable to explain, I determined to follow them. The events that transpired are inexplicable to me. The only solution that I have for the puzzle is that, for the time being, I was someone else, some poor devil who lost his life in the attempt to avert a German surprise on Verdun. For I swear that I was propelled by some force stronger than my own will. Cautiously, I waited until I heard their voices trailing off in the distance. Then I sprang to the trap, and a second later dropped through into the darkness of the cellar. I stumbled about until I found the wall. Following it with my hands, I came to an opening. Far ahead in the darkness I saw a tiny speck of light bobbing up and down. It was the candle carried by the men I was following. Without thought of the future, I followed in their wake. On they went. Then, suddenly, the passageway widened out into a huge cavern. Relying on the darkness, I crept closer until I was only a few yards away from them. Hiding behind a huge pile of boxes and barrels heaped up at one side, I listened to their conversation. At first I was unable to understand what they were about to do. Then with a muttered, "Shh," one of them cautiously drew aside a small block of what appeared to be solid rock, and peeping out over my hiding place, I gazed through the little opening into a brilliantly lit passageway. I caught a glimpse of uniforms. Through the opening came scraps of conversation in French. The truth flashed over me. I was looking into the underground defenses of Verdun. The Germans had tunneled up to them and were waiting only for the minute that the defenders were the fewest, to break down the thin barrier which held them back and throw their hordes into the very vitals of the French defense. Even as the thought came to me, the watcher closed the opening softly and, with a muttered word to his companion, lighted a lantern and waved it across his body like a signal torch. And a signal it was, for instantly a distant whistle sounded. Then lights leaped up as far as the eye could see, and from the distance came the tramp, tramp, tramp of marching feet. I forgot that I was dealing with phantoms. The thing was too horribly real. I searched about me for a weapon, for some way to warn the unsuspecting men on the other side of that frail partition. In the semi-darkness to which I was rapidly growing accustomed, my eyes fell upon an open box. It was heaped up with hand grenades. I made out the markings of other boxes. I almost shouted for joy, for the pile was a huge ammunition dump, placed there by the invaders in readiness for the crucial moment. Seizing a grenade in either hand, I pulled the pins with my teeth and held them in readiness. Closer and closer came the German hordes. The whole cavern and passageway was filled with them. There were thousands, it seemed. The air was thick and heavy with the odor of their sweat. Then, just as the head of the column reached me, I hurled the bombs, not at the advancing enemy, but straight into the big pile of ammunition. The leaders heard me, saw me. They came at me with a rush. The ground trembled, a concussion. I felt myself being hurled through the air. Around me rang screams and cries of mortal agony. Then came oblivion. There is nothing more that I can tell you. How I came here, I have no recollection. Evidently, my mind blank, I found some exit on this side of the valley. I only know that you found me here, outside. My secret is yours. As a man of science, you will probably try to find the way into the place from which I have come. Take my advice and stay away. Now I am tired, Professor. I must rest. Chapter 5. Excerpt from the report of Professor Phineas Parmalee, Bachelor of Arts, Doctor of Laws and other qualifications. Mr. Blake passed away shortly after completing his strange narrative. The members of the Parmalee scientific expedition spent nearly a week searching the vicinity in the hope of discovering the opening through which he came, from the valley. But our efforts were fruitless. I would be tempted to put his story of the valley where dead men live down as a hallucination resulting from his terrible experiences during the war. But for one thing, I sent a courier by way of Chattahoochee Pass to interview Jameson. The letter says that the date given by Blake was correct. He crossed the mountains, as he stated, in 5 days. I confess myself puzzled. We buried poor Blake where we found him. Requiescat in pace. End of the Valley Where Dead Men Live by Harold Ward. Brothers of the Coast by J.G. Kofoed. First published in The Black Mask, August 1920. I dropped over the side of the Mary Rose when she steamed out of Port Royal and swam back to the wharf. It was a foolish thing to do, for the harbor was full of ground sharks, but the heat and rather too much rum and sugar had made me reckless. Probably, too, I had imbibed some of the devil-may-care spirit of this ancient nesting place of the buccaneers. When I reached the dock, I was dizzy and blown from my exertions. It was terribly hot. Something seemed to be dragging at the nape of my neck, and the winking lights in Port Royal Harbor looked like the blazing eyes of mammoth animals. I sat down on a cask and watched the red lantern on the Mary Rose's stack disappear into the night. I couldn't quite recall why I had come back to Port Royal. It was because of something someone had told me. Damn that rum! My head was like an empty barrel. I could not remember a thing. After a bit, I lit my pipe, having tobacco and matches safe in a waterproof bag, as all sailormen should. Gradually, the fog in my brain started to shred out. I began to remember. First, it was Mary Logan. She had promised to marry me back in New Bedford. She had laid her little hands in my great horny ones and pressed her lips against my cheeks, murmuring words of endearment and promising to wed me in a fortnight. All the time she knew she was lying, for her plans had been laid to run away with Benji Harrison that very night. Something snapped inside of me then. The world went black before my eyes. Later I shipped on the Mary Rose, bound for Port Royal. But it wasn't Mary's treachery that had made me leave the old tramp. What was it? I pressed my fists against my aching temples and tried to think. I had it. It was on account of what Hong Fat showed me, that and the sugared rum, I guess. The filthy, slit-eyed Chinaman was a magician in his own country, he said, and I'll give it to him that he was clever. For $2 he went through his whole bag of tricks, but it didn't satisfy me. I'm a deep-water sailor, and I come from a long line of blue-nosed, psalm-singing Puritans, but there's a streak of the mystic in me. I always wanted to look behind the veil, and Hong Fat said he could lift it for me, so I gave him $5 to do it. He brought out a little bronze bowl from under his robe and made some passes over it with his lean, long-nailed fingers. A thick, oily smoke curled up from it and almost hid his emaciated yellow face and beady eyes. Then he asked me in his crooked Shantung dialect if I could understand Chinese. I told him yes, rather sourly, for the smoke was making me drowsy. "Sailor man," he said in his sing-song way, "you are a brave one, a brave man, but you have done enough wrong to offend the gods, wrongs that you must atone for." "Wrongs?" I said. "I've led a pretty rough life, but a square one, and I can't call to mind anyone in particular that I've wronged. I'd like to kill Benji Harrison, but I haven't done it, so you can't call that a wrong. As for Mary Logan, no, I can't call any to mind," I said. What of the smoke there was a tightening around my throat, and my arms and legs had lost all feeling. "Hurry up, tell me, what was it when?" "Not in this life," droned Hong Fat. "Long, long ago." The smoke flattened out like a grey screen. There were pictures on it, but so jumbled and twisted at first that I could not make head or tail of them. I seemed to see Mary's face peep out, but I couldn't be sure. Then the pictures began to take shape. Familiar things flashed up. I seemed to be going back into the past, centuries ago. Suddenly there sprang into view the old city of Panama, with its houses of aromatic rosewood and the tower of the great cathedral of St. Anastasius. I could see the slave markets, where black men were being sold, while their buyers sat at tables, sipping Peruvian wine. Beyond the city rolled the green savannas, and on one side, an arm of the sea crept inland. It was the Panama of the old days before Sir Henry Morgan sacked it. I don't know why I recognized it, for the ancient city was gone long before I was born. There is left only a tangle of weeds and sun-cracked limestone. The slave market is a swamp, the haven a stretch of surf-beaten mud, inhabited by pelicans quarreling over the stinking remains of fish. But in spite of that, I saw old Panama there in the smoke, and felt as a man does when he comes upon a forgotten nook. Except for this, at sight of all that beauty, a crawling horror welled up in my throat, and I would have screamed and beat the air, but it was as though only my brain was present. I had no consciousness of a physical body. Men came into the picture. They were muscular and bronzed, with the rolling gait of sailors. They wore hats, wide of brim, and running into a peak, dirty linen shirts, and knickerbockers. Around their waists were sashes, bristling with knives, and they carried guns of a make that would seem strange to modern eyes. They were Morgan's buccaneers on their way to the sack of Panama, to pillage and burn and torture and rape. I recognized them, Dubose, with his swagger and black mustachios, squat Sawkins, one-eyed Peter Harris, Ringrose, and then, God pity me, I saw myself, running with the rest, sweat-stained, ragged, but with the lust of battle flushing my cheeks. At the head of the troop was a tall man, with a face framed by lank grey curls, as cruel and evil and ruthless a face as this old world has ever seen. His clothes, of silks and satin and lace, were as weather-worn as those of his men. No need to ask myself who it was. I knew him as I had known the others. Morgan the Damned, the man I had followed in a forgotten century across the blood-smeared waters of the Caribbean. I knew then why Hong Fat had said my wrong was a great one. None could fight under the black flag of this arch-brother of the coast without loading his soul with crime. Sitting there in a dazed trance, I watched the capture and sack of Panama, living over again the wild excitement of that day. The clash of swords on steel casques and breastplates, the priests and nuns whipped before the advance to place scaling ladders against the walls, hate-twisted Spanish faces in the desperate struggle on the ramparts. The final capitulation of the town. The smoke cloud grew darker. The pictures that followed faded as though the scene of torture and outrage were too terrible for the black art of Hong Fat to compass. Through the haze, I saw the Chinaman's yellow face and beady eyes watching me with a sort of sardonic leer. I tried to speak. I fought the air with my numbed arms, but the words would not come to my lips. "That is not all," croaked Hong Fat in his weird dialect. "There is more." The smoke screen flattened again, as though his claw-like hand had stroked it into a semblance of grey velvet. The figures grew lifelike on the cursed chart. This time it showed the guardroom of the fort at Panama, a room piled high with plunder torn from the ravished town. Through the open casements, I could see the fires of the burning houses, and memory brought back the shouts of the pirates and the shrieks of tortured citizens. There were two men in the room, Morgan, with his fierce, wrinkled face, and I was there. You might think it a trick of the Chinaman's, but as each scene flashed on, I recalled it. Oh yes, I had been there, as vile as any of those blood-stained brothers of the coast. And my punishment was stretching through the ages. I hung on each succeeding step, my breath whistling through my nostrils like a foundered horse. Morgan waved his hand, and a woman was led in between two buccaneers. At sight of her, the whole tale came back to me. Her face was the face of Mary Logan, dark and proud and beautiful. She wore the dress of a Spanish gentlewoman, and I remembered that back in those fading days of the 17th century. She bore the name of Donna Isabella de Guaira, and that I loved her then as I loved her reincarnation named Mary Logan. I had saved her life in Panama before I joined Morgan's crew, and had killed her Spanish lover when he found me in her garden. They outlawed me, of course, and I became a pirate to come back to her, the only way that was open for me. She swore that she loved me and would wait. When they led her in, my heart blazed. At last, the hour of my triumph had come. There on the smoke screen, Morgan leaned back in his chair, and over the ages, I heard his voice ringing in my ears. This man says he loves you. Steth, you're worth loving, madame, but why throw yourself away on him when there are better men around? I looked at her, my lips moving. It is not Harry Morgan's way to stand back when there are women or gold to get, the pirate said. You can have him if your love is so strong that it will face death for him. So, sure as you take him, I'll burn you both at the stake. My hand went to the knife at my hip, but I was helpless. The muskets of the two pirates were leveled at me. And if I do not choose him, senor? The girl asked. Morgan's face wreathed itself in a terrible smile. If you choose me, I'll cover you with diamonds. By my faith, not a ship on the Spanish Main but will contribute to your wealth. So there you have it. Holyoke and death, or Sir Henry Morgan and wealth. The girl's dark eyes flamed into little golden points. He killed the man who loved me, she said. He took a life for his own selfish pleasure, senor. Is it not possible that he will also take mine if I cleave unto you? The buccaneer's pistol was in his hand. Stay with me, and Holyoke dies, said he. Donna Isabella, who in this century betrayed me again, looked me full in the eyes. Her own were hard. I will stay with you, Signor Morgan, she whispered. Then I saw in the smoke Morgan's pistol flame. It was the end for me. Chapter 2. I came to myself with a nervous jerk. The lights of Port Royal twinkled at my back. The Mary Rose had disappeared. How long I had been sitting there on the cask, pondering the strange things Hong Fat had shown me, I do not know. My head felt queer. The dragging sensation at the nape of my neck was stronger. I staggered a little as I walked off the wharf. For how many eons would Mary's treachery be repeated in reparation for my murder of the Spanish grandee? As the Donna Isabella, she had betrayed me to Morgan. As Mary Logan, she had cast me aside for Benji Harrison. And as surely as we died and were born again, she would repeat that treachery unless I knew Port Royal as well as anyone. But tonight it seemed strange to my eyes, somehow smaller, older, and more cramped. Why this should be, I could not tell, unless Hong Fat's cursed smoke still twisted my senses. I followed the crooked street until I came to the Blue Anchor Inn, a tavern huddled under the lee of the old Spanish fort, the very tavern, too, where Sir Henry Morgan had planned the sack of Panama. The night was warm, the doors wide flung, and I heard 100 rollicking voices roaring out that melody by the poet of London town, so popular among the buccaneers. In frolic, dispose your pounds, shillings and pence. We'll be damnably mouldy 100 years hence. Why should they sing that 17th century ballad in the Port Royal of 1920? Controlling, by an effort, the nervous twitch of my muscles, I entered the Blue Anchor. It was not the room itself, hazy with the fumes of tobacco smoke and smelling strongly of the native rum, that startled me. It was the men sitting around the tables, pounding the oaken tops with their mugs and flagons and roaring that old carefree ditty. They were Morgan's men, dingy clothed, scarlet-sashed, heavily armed. God of battles! Was I mad? There sat Peter Harris, with a black patch over his missing eye. Here swaggered Dubose, mustachios bristling, and at the head of the table, Morgan, as savage and ruthless-looking as when he had roamed the Main. That had been before the first King Charles lost his head, and this was 1920. Perhaps I staggered a bit. At any rate, I stood blinking dazedly through the haze. They saw me, raised their flagons and shouted, "Holyoke! Welcome, old scoundrel. We sail tomorrow for the sack of Panama." I had eyes for none of them but Morgan. He lay back in his chair, one fist gripping the pewter mug, his gaze riveted on me. I rested my knuckles on the table and stared at him as I sought to control the quaver that I knew would sound in my voice. My brain hammered like a kettle drum. "So 'tis you, is it?" cried the buccaneer captain. "Old Holyoke as I live." "Yes," I said hoarsely. "And what would you have of me, my bold rover?" "Your life," said I, "if I can take it. Are you real flesh and blood? If you are, 'fore God, I'll have a knife between your ribs for what you did to me and the Donna Isabella." His voice was dreamy. Donna Isabella? I call her not to mind. There were many women in my life, many of them. Harry Morgan's way, you know. "At Panama," I shouted. There was a red mist before my eyes. How I hated the man. If I had much to answer for, what punishment could fit his crimes? "Ah, yes, at Panama." I tired of her quickly, and she went the way of the rest. But what would you do? I died peaceably in my bed, Holyoke, not on the rack as the Spaniards hoped I would. How can you avenge your black-eyed aristocrat? What can you do to a man who has been dead these 2 centuries and more? The pirates laughed and pounded their flagons on the table. Something snapped in my brain. The room grew black, save for that lean, sneering face framed by its grey curls. Morgan had thrust back his chair and risen, smiling. I was unarmed, but I rushed at him, all my fear of the man swept away in the passionate urge for vengeance. He carried a long knife in the scarlet sash around his waist. I tore it away, knowing that the man was a ghost and that I could do him no harm. I swung the glittering blade aloft, and then the blackness of death enveloped me. I felt the salt foam on my lips. I. Chapter 3. Excerpt from the Port Royal Jamaican. A most unfortunate occurrence marred the brilliant buccaneer fete given in honor of the governor last night. An American sailor named Holyoke deserted from his ship, the Mary Rose, which sailed yesterday for Boston. He went to the Blue Anchor Tavern, which had been a favorite resort of Sir Henry Morgan's crew in the old days of the Brothers of the Coast, apparently much the worse for drink. An old Chinaman named Hong Fat had persuaded Holyoke that he was a reincarnated member of the buccaneers who sacked Panama. Everyone present in the Blue Anchor had heard of the hoax. They deluded the drunken sailor into believing that they were all Morgan's men, returned to life. Holyoke apparently became crazed with fear, snatched a machete from the girdle of Lieutenant Buckingham, who was impersonating Sir Henry Morgan, and stabbed himself. Chapter 4. On the same day, the New Bedford Herald told of the suicide of a woman named Mary Logan, who had stabbed herself with a sailor's knife, a curio owned by Benjamin Harrison, and said to have been carried at the sack of Panama by Sir Henry Morgan. End of Brothers of the Coast by J.G. Kofoed. The Summons by Henry Altimus. First published in The Black Mask, August 1920. It was Elsa Lloyd's first experience with death as a nurse at St. Luke's. She was the youngest graduate at the hospital, slender and frail, with blue eyes that betrayed the strain she had been under despite her brave effort to appear self-possessed. The older nurses had been extremely helpful, not at all resentful that she had been chosen for so important a case. But she had pursued her duties to the very end, courageously and competently, without requiring any assistance. It was nearly over now. Schofield Carrington was dead, his body was soon to be removed to his home, and she was studying the carefully kept chart of her patient preparatory to turning it over to the head nurse. She was seated at a little table in the floor office, the chart before her, using this brief respite after the trying experience of the preceding night to collect herself. When the bell rang softly and the indicator clicked over her head, Elsa Lloyd did not look up. As Carrington's private nurse, she was expected to answer only his summons. But presently she was aware that a floor nurse had entered in answer to the bell, and pausing a moment before the indicator, had come up close to her. "It's 42 calling," said the nurse. "Isn't that Carrington?" Elsa Lloyd came to her feet quickly, her eyes lifting to the indicator, a little tinge of color coming to her cheeks. "Yes," she said weakly. Her lips fell apart. Her hand caught the back of the chair from which she had just risen, her eyes still fixed on the little plate showing the numerals 42 on the indicator. Her tired brain could not grapple with the strange situation. Carrington had passed away in the early hours of the morning, and only half an hour before she had left his room, her duties over. And now, the bell. She turned at last, question in her eyes. "Perhaps it's Dr. Stockbridge," the nurse ventured. "He's in the operating room," said Elsa quickly. "Or someone else." And seeing the weariness in the young girl's face, she added, "Shall I answer for you?" "Thank you. I'll go." She hurried down the long, silent corridor. She paused at the door, hesitated, then knocked lightly. There was no response. Her hand lowered to the knob. She turned it, and the door yielded. There was no one in the room. Everything was exactly as she had left it half an hour before. The drawn shades, through which the morning sunlight filtered pale and warm, the stillness of death. And in the far corner of the huge room, the bed with its rigid, silent occupant. Elsa's first impulse was to turn and escape, but she checked herself, waited, her back to the door, while the rapid beating of her heart subsided. Presently she moved toward the bed, slowly, her feet scarcely lifting from the floor. Nothing had been altered, not a wrinkle in the sheet that covered the dead man's body had been changed. She looked down into his face, observed the strong features, immobile in death, the thin lips firmly locked, the square chin thrust forward, defiant, challenging even now. Schofield Carrington had not wanted to die. The great financier, who had feared nothing, had not feared death. But he had not been ready to go. He had wanted to hold off the hand of death only a little while longer, but it had come relentlessly, and his features still showed the marks of the dead man's struggle, the unhappiness of his last moments, which had come without the fulfillment of his cherished hope. Elsa's eyes lifted to the bell that hung from the back of the bed, corded wire with a button at the end. The pressure of which had summoned her so often in the past few weeks to the side of her patient, had summoned her even now to his side. Some hand had touched it within the last few minutes. Whose? She lingered a while, baffled, immobile in the presence of the inexplicable circumstance. "It must be some mistake," she said at last. She spoke aloud, to reassure herself, and to reassure anyone who might hear her. Somehow she felt a vague presence in the room. She dared not look about her, and having spoken, she turned and hurried out of the room. The nurse was waiting for her at the office door. She noted the pallor in Elsa's face, the agitation which her strained features did not conceal. Elsa took the hand she extended, leaning heavily on it. "Someone has been and gone," she said in a soothing voice. "You're unstrung. You ought to." She stopped abruptly. Their eyes met and they stood close, neither daring to turn. For the indicator had clicked again. It was the elder nurse who first summoned the courage to look, and when their eyes met again, Elsa knew what she had seen. "It's 42, said the elder nurse in a hoarse voice. Elsa's head lowered, a shudder running down her frame, and her companion led her to a chair into which the girl dropped heavily. "Sometimes the indicator gets out of order," muttered the elder nurse. "It may be that, though I don't recall its ever happening before. The wires may get crossed or something." Her voice trailed away. She knew that her assurances were unconvincing to Elsa. They were unconvincing to herself. She realized that her usual presence of mind was not at her command. Disciplined in the shadow of suffering and death, she was aware that, for the first time in her experience, she was confronted by the intrusion of an intangible element which eluded her understanding. Carrington was dead. There was no one in his room, yet his bell was ringing. "We ought to report it," she said at last. "Someone ought to be in the room. It's—" She paused as a young intern entered the office. Her face lit up hopefully. "Doctor," she said, coming toward him. 42 is calling, won't you?" "That's Carrington's room, isn't it?" asked the intern. "Yes." "Well, it's Miss Lloyd's case. Why doesn't she go?" "She's just been there, and there's no one in the room." "What?" stammered the intern. "And that's the second time the bell has rung." More from the crumpled attitude of Elsa Lloyd in her chair than from the words of the elder nurse, the intern gathered the meaning of the strange situation. His eyes were wide with amazement. He looked to the indicator and then turned to the nurse. His lips moved, stirred mutely a moment. "Does Dr. Stockbridge know?" he asked at last. "No." "I'll tell him." And he spun about on his heel and was gone. The nurse moved toward the indicator mechanically, her hand lifting slowly and pressing the knob that released the number. The indicator was bare, but scarcely had her arm lowered to her side than a bell tinkled. It was 42 again. Elsa Lloyd, her elbows on the little desk, her face buried in her hands, did not look up. She knew from the touch of her companion's hand on her shoulder what the bell meant. The nurse slipped into a chair beside the younger woman. For a long time she was silent, then, "I can't understand it," she muttered, half to herself. "I've never had such an experience before. I've seen so many deaths, and death was always so final, so completely the end. Of course there's the soul, the spirit. It's called by so many names, and I've heard much nonsense about it. I never believed, few of us do, but every now and then something happens, like this. What can it mean?" Despite herself, a tremor, half of doubt, half of awe, shook her. She turned to Elsa. "What do you know about Carrington?" she asked. "You were with him for weeks. Can you think of anything that—" She did not complete her question, her thought too unformed for words. "Was there anything," she resumed in a moment, "before he died, anything that might explain this?" Elsa sat up, but her head was averted as she spoke. "I don't understand," she said, her voice low and frail. "But when I was in the room just now, I seemed to be aware of—" "Of what?" prompted the elder nurse. "Something. I don't know what. As though someone were in the room besides myself and it." "The corpse?" Elsa nodded. "He didn't want to die," the girl went on after a while. "There was something between him and his son. You know how unhappy he was about him. He loved him, his only son, and he didn't want to die feeling that young Carrington hadn't redeemed himself. You know what a black sheep he's been. Once I came into the room just after his son had left. The old man had been crying. I think it was that kept him alive long after we knew his case was hopeless. He told me once he couldn't die until his son had made good, that his spirit would never rest." "His spirit? Did he say that?" "Yes." The elder nurse's eyes closed slowly, and her hands met in her lap. "Do you think—" began Elsa, leaning forward. "I don't know," muttered the elder woman, her voice scarcely audible. Both women came to their feet as they heard hurried footsteps approaching. The intern entered, a coat flung over his arm. "He's coming," he announced. Dr. Stockbridge entered the office, visibly annoyed and angry, his long fingers busy with the laces of his operating apron, which he was removing. Behind him came, unhurried and calm, Carrington's lifelong friend and the executor of his will, Madison Dodd. "What's this silly nonsense I hear about bells?" the surgeon demanded, slipping into the coat the intern held and advancing toward the women. "Why didn't you notify me sooner? And why aren't you in the room to find out what it means, Miss Lloyd?" "She just came from the room, Dr. Stockbridge," explained the elder nurse, defending the girl. "There was no one there." "This is too absurd," exploded the surgeon. "I've never heard of such a thing. Miss Lloyd should be in that room. She's had no sleep, doctor, and she's very tired." "Then why don't you go?" You're afraid." "How ridiculous." "Well, we'll have—" He turned, but the intern was gone. Dr. Stockbridge frowned. His eyes went toward the indicator. "When did that bell ring?" he demanded. "About 10 minutes ago, and—" A bell rang and a faint click came from the indicator. The number 42, which had not been lowered, vibrated. "It's been ringing every 10 minutes just like that," said the elder nurse, edging away from the instrument. Dr. Stockbridge frowned. Then, striding across the room, he pressed the knob, releasing the number. He turned to the nurse. "I'm going into that room myself," he said severely, "and we'll have this nonsense over with. Someone is ringing that bell, and we'll know who it is. If it rings while I'm there, let me know." He stepped toward the door. "I'll go with you, doctor," said Carrington's friend, speaking for the first time. The men walked down the corridor, side by side. The door of room 42 was closed. Dr. Stockbridge pushed it open impatiently and allowed Dodd to enter first. "I hope you'll forgive this nonsense, Mr. Dodd," he said, closing the door. "These women there—" But Dodd, paying no heed to the doctor, was advancing toward the bed, his face grave. He stopped within a foot of it, looking down on the still form beneath him, his hands clasped behind his back. Dr. Stockbridge looked about the room. Its hospital bareness made it manifest at once that no one could be concealed in it. It seemed to him absurd and undignified that he should be engaged in such a futile and meaningless undertaking. He paced up and down, pausing every now and then to observe the immobile figure of Carrington's friend, wondering what he could be thinking of the whole ridiculous episode. He was a little disturbed that Dodd should take the thing so seriously, treating the matter with silent respect. Once he paused beside him. "I'm a man of science, Mr. Dodd," he began. "To me there's no such thing." There was a light tap on the door and he stopped. He strode to the door and opened it. The intern's head showed. "It rang," the young man said. Dr. Stockbridge's lips parted in astonishment. His hand on the knob, he paused, undecided, looking toward Dodd for some indication of the course to pursue. But Dodd had not stirred, and Stockbridge turned to the youth. "Thank you," he said, and closed the door. For a moment he was at a loss, but when he tried to speak, he was silenced by Dodd's beckoning hand. He approached, stopping at Dodd's side, his eyes following the other man's finger. "I want you to tell me what you see in his face," said Dodd. The request seemed so strange to Dr. Stockbridge that he glanced up quickly to see if Dodd were in earnest. What could he see in a dead man's face but death? However, a glance was sufficient to assure him of his companion's earnestness, and he lowered his eyes. After a long moment of silent scrutiny, the surgeon bent lower, his eyes narrowing. "Yes," he muttered, awed by his discovery. "I see what you mean. It's amazing. It wasn't that way when he died." "What do you see?" interrupted Dodd. "The mouth," said Dr. Stockbridge. "The corners seem to droop more, and the eyelids look more strained. His whole face seems to have changed, as though he were—" "Dissatisfied?" prompted Dodd, as the surgeon hesitated. "Yes, as though he were restless and unhappy about something." "Ah," muttered Dodd. "I noticed that when I first came into the room, and I have been held by it. Dr. Stockbridge," he added, looking up for the first time. "My old friend is restless, dissatisfied. His spirit is not at peace, and that is why the bell is ringing." "Then you think—" "I am certain. And I have been standing here, wondering what he was distressed about, what message he was trying to convey. He is trying to say something to us, Doctor. He is trying to direct our attention to something he wants done, and he will not rest, Doctor, until it is done. I must try to understand him. I must find out what he wants. Have you any idea?" "Perhaps, but I'm not sure." He turned. "Shall we go back to the office?" he asked. When they re-entered the office, they found a group of interns and nurses gathered in a corner of the room. The report of the mysterious calls from room 42 had spread throughout the building, and an awed, silent circle of men and women in hospital uniform were watching the indicator for the call that was momentarily expected. An intern came forward as Dodd and the surgeon entered. "It rang twice while you were out," he said. "And young Carrington is here, in the inner office," he was told, and when he heard the bell ring and how the number came up, he fainted. "He's lying down in there." Dr. Stockbridge, followed by Dodd, hurried to the inner office. Elsa Lloyd was bending over a couch, on which lay Edward Carrington, his back to the door. The girl came forward as the men entered. "He's better now," she said. Dr. Stockbridge approached the couch, caught Carrington's wrist, and touched 2 fingers to his pulse. The youth did not stir, his arm hanging limp in the surgeon's grasp. Dr. Stockbridge looked up at last and nodded reassuringly to Dodd. Then he turned to the girl. "I'll look after him," he said. "We won't need you." The girl withdrew. Madison Dodd retired to the window, standing there with his eyes fixed on the horizon, in deep thought. The surgeon came up to him. "Poor fellow," he muttered. "I can understand how he'd feel about it." Dodd did not reply. Once more the bell in the outer office rang. The indicator clicked. Dr. Stockbridge turned to observe the effect on the youth. He lay there very still, as though he had not heard, but his eyes, turned to the wall, were wide open. He seemed too stunned for any sensation. As the moments fled by, the surgeon grew more and more ill at ease under the strain of the silence and the unsolved mystery. He wondered why they were waiting there, inactive and undecided, and yet when he tried to think about what they could do, he was at a loss. He could not wait there all day, however, obedient to a vague call, an intangible summons from the dead. If only he could persuade Dodd of the absurdity of the whole situation. But how could he convince Dodd when he himself was so completely at sea? He had never believed in such things, and had always dismissed any testimony concerning spirits as the inventions of gullible minds. Yet here before him was evidence he could not easily disregard. He paced the room restlessly, finally pausing beside Carrington's friend. "What can we do?" he asked. "I am thinking," Dodd replied quietly, his eyes still on the horizon. "But," persisted the surgeon, "do you still believe? I am sure that the bell is a summons to someone. If you do not understand its message, it is because it is not meant for you. Perhaps it is not even for me, as I do not grasp its meaning. But it is calling to someone here, or it would not ring, and that person will understand if he is present. Still," the surgeon continued, encouraged, "even granting the existence of a spirit that lingers after death, is it conceivable that such a spirit can assert itself in this way? As a man of science, it seems too fanciful to me." "What," replied Dodd, "can be more fanciful than science itself? It is dumb before the mysteries it pretends to understand. Can you, as a scientist, explain to me why, when a button is pressed in room 42, a bell rings in this room?" "Electricity," began the surgeon. "And what is electricity? Even science does not pretend to know. Is it not inconceivable that it can flow through solid copper wire? And yet it does. Man's soul, his spirit, is more mysterious than electricity. Why can it not flow through the ether and create a disturbance in its environment? Released from the body it inhabited, why can it not hover nearby and make its will known to those it wishes to reach?" Schofield Carrington's body died, but his spirit, refusing to die unsatisfied, is still alive, restless, insistent, urging the fulfillment of its desire so it may be set at peace. And it will not give up until it is satisfied. "There," he added as the bell rang, "it is still calling. It will continue until he for whom it is meant obeys the call." "But who is it for?" the surgeon asked weakly. Madison Dodd turned slowly, but his eyes did not meet the surgeon's. They swept the room and paused on the figure of young Carrington, who had stirred for the first time and was now sitting up, his elbows on his knees and his face buried in his hands. The surgeon followed Dodd's gaze. It suddenly dawned on him that perhaps young Carrington, who had not uttered a word, understood. Beneath his surface immobility, a great struggle was taking place, and a difficult resolve was forming. He turned to Dodd, expecting some revelation, but the man's face was a mask. His fingers twined in the cord hanging from the window shade, and his eyes remained fixed on the youth. The surgeon observed young Carrington once more. Slowly, Edward Carrington's hands lowered from his face. He rose and turned. His eyes were clear, his features firm, and he came forward with a sense of decision in his entire bearing. "Mr. Dodd," he said in a slow, level voice, pausing before his father's friend, "that bell was for me." Dr. Stockbridge's eyes widened with amazement at this simple avowal, but Madison Dodd's expression did not change. "Well?" he prompted calmly, his fingers still toying with the window shade cord. "I have been battling with myself," said young Carrington, "all morning ever since father." He paused, and his lips trembled. "You know how unhappy he was about me. my failure to live up to his name, and he died feeling that he had failed to redeem me. But all morning I have felt his nearness. When I came in here and heard the bell and saw the call from his room, I knew. The call was for me. I understood what he wanted me to do. I obey." He stepped forward, and his hand went to his breast pocket. When it emerged, it held a long envelope. "This is it," he said, handing the envelope to Dodd. "It is Father's will. It leaves me without a penny, as he said it would. I have deserved nothing better." The shade flew up with a bang as Madison Dodd released the cord and extended his hand for the envelope, which was heavily sealed and addressed to him. Slowly, he put on his gold-rimmed pince-nez and thrust his finger under the flap of the envelope to tear it open. But he paused and looked up as he heard a low murmur in the outer office. Dr. Stockbridge looked up too. Nurses and interns were whispering excitedly to each other, their eyes on the clock. The surgeon followed their glance and then understood the source of their agitation. The minute hand pointed to the half hour. The bell should have rung, as it had every 10 minutes that morning with unfailing precision. It had not rung. The hushed excitement of the uniformed men and women grew in intensity as a minute passed, and still the bell was silent. 2 minutes passed, 3 minutes. Dr. Stockbridge turned to Madison Dodd. Carrington's friend stood near the window, a sheaf of legal papers, evidently the will, in one hand, and a typewritten sheet in the other. He was reading this, and he looked up as the surgeon approached. He waved his arm toward the outer office. "Send them away, doctor," he said quietly. "Carrington's summons has been answered." One by one, the nurses and interns filed out of the office in obedience to Dr. Stockbridge's gesture of dismissal. When they were gone, the surgeon returned to Madison Dodd's side. "You'll understand when I read this," Dodd said. He adjusted his glasses and brought the typewritten sheet closer. "This is my last test for Ed," he read. "If he gives this envelope to you, as I instructed him, then my original will stands as it is, leaving all to him. When I gave my boy this envelope, I told him it contained a new will, disowning him and leaving him without a penny. If he has enough manhood to give this to you, then I shall know that he has repented and that he has the courage to accept his punishment. In that case, he will prove himself a true Carrington and will deserve the fortune that comes to him. This is exactly as we planned it, old friend. My prayer is that he will make good. My spirit shall not rest until he does, and I trust that my everlasting peace will not be disturbed by my boy's craven failure to deliver this message to you. Schofield Carrington." Madison Dodd looked up, folding the sheet he had just read. "Schofield Carrington's spirit is at peace now," he said solemnly. The men clasped hands at the door in silent accord. Dr. Stockbridge's lips pursed, and his eyes lowered. "Mr. Dodd," he said, "this is the first experience of the kind I've ever had. As a man of science—" "My dear doctor," Dodd broke in, "science is still in its infancy. Some day it may be able to explain many things that are still beyond understanding." He nodded and turned on his heel. A smile graced his face, but Dr. Stockbridge did not see it. "Basement," said Dodd to the elevator man as the car descended. Emerging from the cage, Dodd hurried down the dimly lit corridor. He paused before a door marked "Electrician." A man in overalls rose as Dodd entered, touching his cap. "Did I get that shade signal right?" he asked with a smile. "Perfectly," said Dodd, drawing a banknote from his wallet and pressing it into the man's hand. "Now you may rearrange those wires. You did splendidly. Thank you." The man touched his cap, and Madison Dodd, nodding, passed out of the room. End of The Summons by Henry Altimus. Where the Span Splits by Sam Heilman. First published in The Black Mask, August 1920. Chapter 1. Tomorrow at 7:32 a.m., I shall have reached the end of my 35th year. I have prepared a program for the morning that I have well considered for 15 years. At 6:30 I shall arise and breakfast with a good appetite. From 7 to 7:25 I shall occupy myself in filling the bathtub and regulating the temperature of the water. It will take at least 14 minutes to get the exact warmth desired. Something between 98 and 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Having completed this task to my satisfaction, I shall go into the living room, place a record of Massenet's Elegy on the music machine, and start it off softly and slowly. I shall then return to the bathroom, again testing the water and regulating the flow of hot and cold to maintain the required temperature. I shall climb into the tub. With a razor, I shall cut the arteries in both wrists. This will be done at 7:32 exactly, the hour of my birth and the end of my 35th year. I shall lie back contentedly and laugh. My body and the water being in caloric harmony, there will be no pain. This I have learned from the Romans, who, of all men, know best how to live splendidly and die luxuriously. To the compassionate music of the elegy, I shall glide and melt into the infinite with the quiet smile of a victor. For I shall have defeated the law of compensation, beaten it as it never has been beaten before. I am not insane. A cringing, spiritless, whining world will doubtless call my act one of an unbalanced mentality, but what care I? I have no reason that society would accept for this deed of self-elimination. I have no financial difficulties, no worries prey on me, my health is perfect, I have not been unsuccessful in love. In fact, as I write this tonight, I am exuberantly and exultingly happy and carefree. When the cat pounces, the rat will not be there. I can picture his look of chagrin. I am putting this on paper, not that others may profit by my example, for I know they will not. Frankly, I am doing it in a spirit of braggadocio. I want a world of rats to know that one rat has escaped the claws of the inevitable. I want it known that the years that are mine I have taken and used to the utmost. The years that compensation takes unto itself I shall not intrude upon. We are quits. We are breaking even, and to break even with it is victory for me, complete, smashing, thorough, and absolute. Even at the risk of being tedious, I shall go into some details, for it is only in this way that the full extent of my triumph can be made plain to a race of futile, unthinking, servile pawns. When I was 12 years old, my father died. He was in his 36th year at the time. He had been ill for many months with a malady that must have been extremely painful. His groans broke into my sleep at all hours of the night. I often heard him plead with the doctor for morphine. "If I only could die," he moaned in his agony. I remember the sufferings of my mother as she nursed him. She had been a pretty and joyous creature, but in those dreadful months, the pink in her cheeks fled before a dead sallowness. The eyes that had once laughed and sparkled with the joy of living lay drearily deep behind dark circles. The lustre departed from her hair, a hopeless stoop came into her shoulders, and the shuffle of despondency into her feet. I think I was glad when my father died. I cried at the funeral, not because of his passing, but because of her he had left behind, that broken, crushed mother of mine. At 12, one is not given much to speculation or introspection, yet I wondered, why had my father been tormented so? His death I understood clearly. That was merely the end, and I knew that all things had to end. But why the torture of his last hours? He had been a kind-hearted, gentle soul, considerate and self-sacrificing. He had worked hard for mother and me. He had given of his substance to the needy and bent a shoulder to the feeble. His life had been clean and wholesome, yet he had been smitten with flaming darts. I could think of no reason. 6 months afterwards, my mother died. She too suffered greatly, I know, but so weak was she in spirit and body that no voice was left loud enough to cry her agony. My wonder increased. Why had she been smitten so? I went to live with my father's brother. Uncle John was thin and inclined to irritability, yet he treated me with much kindness, unsmiling but very real. I remember one evening when Aunt Susan had sharply called me in from play to my neglected studies, he had said, "Let the boy alone with his fun. Later on, he will have troubles enough. Don't rob him of his blessed childhood." And he had sighed. There were two other members of the family, one a boy about my age, good-natured and full of animal spirits. The other, an older sister of Aunt Susan, a sweet-tempered, self-effacing little woman who had been born a cripple. One leg was shorter than the other, congenital hip disease they called it. I grew very fond of Aunt Stella. Uncle John was troubled with dyspepsia. After each cautious meal he took pills. They didn't seem to help him much, for I still recall his distress on the few occasions when he grew reckless and tasted of forbidden things. I remember the half-sorrowful, half-envious look in his eyes as he watched George and me romp around the place, slide down the balustrades, and in other boyish ways give ear to the call of strident vitality within us. The wistful eyes that observed us as we gorged at mealtimes come vividly before me, even now. One winter's day when the sidewalks were icily slick, Aunt Stella fell on the sidewalk and hurt her bad hip. There was an operation, gangrene, and finally the great emancipation. "Uncle," I said 3 days after the funeral, "why did Aunt Stella suffer so?" He seemed startled for a moment. Then he answered, "My boy, when you are about twice as old as you are now, you will understand. It is the law of compensation. We all must pay for what we take out of life." I questioned him further, but he would not pursue the subject. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind was racing with the problem of compensation but making little headway. In the course of a restless doze, I dreamed that angels and demons were fighting for the possession of my body. The angels seemed to be hopelessly outnumbered and were getting the worst of it when suddenly they came over to the side of the demons and joined them, sticking knives and pitchforks into me. Chapter 2. Life at Uncle John's soon returned to its normal gait. George and I again romped all over the place, although I felt myself a bit subdued and prone to spells of puzzled reflection. My uncle's attacks of dyspepsia continued, and Aunt Susan complained almost constantly of feeling poorly, without any definite ailment as far as I could learn. We had many visitors. Mostly they were men and women in their late 30s and 40s. Although much of the conversation was beyond me, I liked to sit quietly in the large living room and listen to the callers. I believe it was during this period that my views relative to the law of compensation took coherent shape. While my foster parents' friends discussed every subject under the sun, there was one topic upon which each and all spoke fluently and often: their ailments. Everybody seemed to have something the matter with him or her. Mrs. Austin had neuralgia, Mr. Hawkins had a heart lesion, Mr. Swift suffered from constant, inexplicable pains in the back, Mrs. Stephens brooded about an incipient goiter, Mr. Holliday was worried about a tenacious cough, and Mrs. Taylor's stoutness preyed on her mind. Of all the visitors, my favorite was John Shelton, a school principal. He had no particular malady except that his eyes gave him trouble. He complained that they hurt when he read at night. "Mr. Shelton," I said to him one evening, when we happened to be alone in the living room, "do all people get sick when they get to be 30 or thereabouts?" He laughed good-naturedly. "That's a funny question. Of course not." "Why is it then," I asked, "that people of that age are always talking about their ailments or looking worried? There's you, for example. Why aren't you happy all the time, like I am?" "Oh, you're young," he replied. "You have no cares, no responsibilities. There's nothing to keep you from being contented 24 hours a day." "That's what I thought," I replied. "As you grow older, you get the things that make you unhappy." "That's the way of life," he answered soberly. "Take my advice, young man, and get all the pleasure you can out of your boyhood. The sweetness of living is now yours." Suddenly he turned with a laugh and said, "Paul, do you know where your heart is?" "Certainly," I said, striking my left side with my hand. "You're wrong," he smiled. "It's here." He pointed to a spot 3 inches to the right of the place I had indicated, and 2 inches lower. "Know where your stomach is?" I showed him where I thought it was. Apparently, I knew less about the stomach than I did about the heart. I was somewhat ashamed and told Shelton that we had just started the study of anatomy at high school. "Books will never tell you just where your vital organs are," he said, "and the longer you remain in ignorance, the better off you will be. When you do learn exactly where your stomach is, it will be the finger of pain pointing it out. Suffering is the perfect instructor in anatomy." Just at that time, other callers arrived, and the questions trembling on the point of my tongue went unasked. Afterward, he avoided the subject of anatomy. The next 3 years passed rapidly, happy, joyous, unrestrained years. My plan of life was rapidly developing. I was determined to squeeze out of existence every drop of happiness it contained before the location of my heart was known to me with exactness. When I was not playing, I observed men and women along novel lines. I read faces for signs of content and unhappiness. I fell into the habit of checking up the number of times I had seen this or that individual in a month. How many times he had been smiling, how many times he had been frowning, how often he had appeared at ease, and how often worried. I did not let these studies interfere with my main program. I sought enjoyment with almost hysterical insistence. I would permit nothing to depress me, nothing to divert me from my purpose. At 18, I was sent to college. Because knowledge came easily, I was a good student. Had it been otherwise, I would have quit the pursuit of learning and sought less strenuous occupation. I had a roommate, Arthur Gates, a jolly harum-scarum, rich man's son, who worshipped at the shrine of play as feverishly as I. Although he was not lacking in serious moments, he was dumbfounded, I know, when I told him my secret. We had been in the history lecture class together that afternoon, when the instructor suddenly turned pale, clutched his coat lapel, and fell at the foot of his desk. He was a man of about 40 and seemingly had been in good health. We helped take him home. I learned that he was a sufferer from angina pectoris, an unusually painful affliction of the heart. In our room that evening, Gates mentioned the instructor's illness. "That could never happen to me," I remarked. "Why?" he asked. "Have you a guarantee on your heart?" "No," I answered slowly, "but I shall not live that long." "What are you talking about? Duckworth isn't over 45. "When my 45th birthday comes around," I replied calmly, "I know I will have been dead 10 years. Gates laughed. "Been to see a fortune teller?" he jeered. "No, but on the day that I finish my 35th year, I shall kill myself." "How do you know," asked my roommate, "that you won't get angina before you're 35? "I don't, but it's hardly likely. The percentage is in my favor." Gates was beginning to be impressed with the fact that I was serious. He gazed at me with puzzled eyes. "Arthur," I said, "I want you to listen to me for a few moments. What I am about to tell you I have told to no other person and will tell to no other person. I feel that I must unbosom myself to someone. Will you listen seriously?" He nodded. I went on. "I am now 21 years old. I have excellent health, plenty of money, no troubles, domestic or otherwise, and what are regarded as excellent prospects. Yet, I tell you in cold blood that at 7:32 a.m. on April 6, 1920, I shall end my life. That will be the exact hour of my birth, 35 years before. Just how I shall do it I do not yet know. Naturally, I shall take the least painful and least unpleasant way." "But why?" interrupted Gates, who had been watching me with strange fascination. "That," I replied, will develop in the course of what I am about to tell you. Understand, I am not trying to influence you in any way. I know that you will not agree with me. When I was a boy, my father and mother both died in great agony. I can see them now, grey with torture, their pallid features furrowed with the lines of suffering and the perspiration of pain on their foreheads. I can still hear my father pleading for death, death that stood outside the door, leeringly biding its time. Afterwards, I lived for many years at the home of an uncle. There, I saw more suffering. I began asking myself these questions: is life worth living? If so, how long should one live? When do the tears of existence begin to outweigh the smiles? At what point in the span do the joys of carrying on no longer balance the sorrows? In seeking answers to my interrogations, I made a close and detailed study of scores of men and women. I watched their faces and searched their souls. I have continued the research at college, coldly and scientifically. I have tables and charts and masses of statistics, and the conclusions I reached by observation have been borne out by analysis and precise data. And my conclusion is this: the average life after 35 is not worth living. I saw a Y trembling on Gates' lips and went on, the span of human life is 70 years. In the first 35 we sow, in the other 35 we reap. It is the law of compensation. The pleasures and enjoyment of existence are freely bestowed in the first half of the span, but the bills begin coming in with the 36th year. I have made up my mind not to pay. When the collector comes, I will be out. My roommate shook his head. That's certainly a bizarre theory, he said. It's not theory, I returned. It's a fact, a grim, irresistible fact. As I told you, I have reached my conclusions by way of scientific research. But how? Asked Gates. I don't understand. For example, I replied, I have gone to a man of 37 night after night for a month and reviewed the entire day with him. I have tabulated the whole of his waking hours under 3 heads: joy, sorrow, neutral. Under the first caption, I have listed everything, no matter how trivial, that afforded the subject content or satisfaction. Under sorrow, I have scheduled every disappointment, every ache, every annoyance, no matter how petty, everything he had hoped would not happen, and so on. Under neutral, I have put the things that could not properly be classed under either of the other headings. And the result? In the particular case I am speaking of, there were twice as many notations under sorrow as there were under joy. I conducted my inquiries with a great number of men and women over a long period, and the results were about the same. With younger persons, it was just the reverse. The dividing line seemed to be just at 35. Between 30 and 35, the joys and sorrows about balanced, with a great number of notations in the neutral column. Under 30, the joys and neutrals seem to have the field pretty well to themselves. Often, of course, the law of compensation begins operating lightly, and years may elapse before the victim notices that he is being dunned for payment. But settlement must be made, and it is made through the body, through those held dear, through ambition, pride, vanity, through everything that is cherished and clung to. But I'm going to dance and leave without paying the piper. Gates listened quietly to my conclusion, a serious expression on his face. After a moment of silence, he said, The ordinary person would laugh at you, Paul, and call you crazy, but I believe that I understand you. Boyhood sorrows have merely distorted your views of life. I have no doubt of your sincerity, and I do not question that right now you believe that you will kill yourself when you are 36. Permit me, as a friend, to doubt it. I venture to say that you will be married in 1920, be the father of several children, and would blush and stammer like a schoolgirl if I should happen along and repeat what you have just told me. You are young, and in the next 15 years, your conception of life will undergo a radical series of changes. No, Arthur, I returned. I shall not change my mind. I propose to enjoy the time I have allowed myself to the utmost. At the end of that period, you will read of my death, if you haven't forgotten all about me. That's all. Let's go downtown, have a few drinks and see a show." Gates was glad to go. I never mentioned the subject of my plans to him again. During some of our boisterous celebrations, I often caught a queer smile in his eyes, but he said nothing. After graduation, we separated. Gates went to his home in California while I moved to New York. For a few years, we corresponded loosely and then lost touch. I lived up to my set program. With a generous income, I was able to do about what I pleased. I went where I wished, ate and drank what and where I wanted, and did little work except that connected with looking after my property. I remained free of serious love entanglements. My health continued excellent, and I had no worries. I do not recall an ache, a pain, or a severe disappointment in 15 years. There was a girl, her name is of no moment, a girl of wondrous beauty and celestial character, who did stagger my resolution for a brief spell. When I felt myself weakening, I went to Bellevue Hospital, where I knew a house surgeon, and walked through the wards. The law of compensation was operating on high gear that evening. I finished my tour, had a good laugh, and never saw her again. So this is the last night. I feel strangely happy. For my final repast, I have ordered a royal gorge. I shall dine heartily at midnight and drink many a glass of rare vintage to the vanquished law of compensation. Then to bed for a few hours of calm rest. After that, tomorrow morning at 7:32. Chapter 4. The following letter was received in the coroner's office from Dr. J.P. Sipes. Dear Sir, the enclosed communication or manuscript was found on a table in the room where Paul Traverse died last night. His death was entirely natural and was due, as stated in the burial certificate, to acute gastritis. The attack followed upon an unusually heavy meal he had eaten before retiring. The matter I am sending you was, I presume, a literary effort on his part. End of Where the Span Splits by Sam Heilman. The Abandoned House by Beulah Poynter. First published in the Black Mask, August 1920. Chapter 1. The blinding rain which had been steadily falling for the last hour cut and stung our faces, and the wind wheezing through the trees about us rocked our little car until it made progress almost impossible. An illuminating streak of lightning, followed by a deafening crash of thunder, caused me to cower down in the seat and cover my ears with my hands. "Well, here's our finish," exclaimed my brother, who had valiantly striven to pilot the machine in the storm. "There's a tree lying directly across the road." He brought the car to a standstill and turned his spotlight on the dark object blocking our path. It was a huge tree, evidently stricken down by the lightning, and it covered the entire road. "What on earth are we going to do?" I sobbed hysterically. "We can't stay out in a storm like this, and we are miles and miles away from anyone." We had been steadily climbing an upward grade, and the cavern-like ravines on either side and the depths of blackness behind me struck a chill in my heart. "I wish we'd never come out on this crazy motor trip," I wailed. "New York is good enough for me. Alan, what can we do?" "I'll see," he answered. "Keep your hand on the brake. This is a pretty stiff hill, and the road is slippery. If the car starts skidding, it's good night." He spoke jocularly enough, but I knew he was worried. Climbing out of the machine, he went around to the big supine tree and examined it. "It's no use, Nell," he called to me, pitching his voice above the roar of the wind. "I can't budge it." In the brief light caused by a second flash of lightning, I saw the stark, bare outlines of a two-story house, possibly 100 feet ahead of us on my right. "Alan, there's a house up there further on the hill," I cried wildly. You're right, there is. It's either an empty one, or its occupants hit the hay early. I'll pull the car out onto the side of the road, and we'll make a run for it." He got back into his seat, and with a few careful maneuvers of the wheel succeeded in bringing the machine around to a spot where it might stand in safety. Then he searched in the darkness until he found a rock, which he placed under the wheel in case something should start it rolling down grade. "Turn up your collar. The rain feels like ice water when you're out in it. That house is probably farther off than it looks." Taking my hand, he helped me out. My feet went into deep mud, and I almost lost my balance. With a little shriek, I clutched him to save myself. Then we started to run. It was uphill all the way, a much steeper and longer climb than I had anticipated, and, as Alan had said, the rain was like ice water beating against the back of my neck and shoulders. I was shaking and shivering like a drowned cat by the time we reached the stoop on the front of the building. The house was barren of fence and surrounding trees, and stood on a sort of knoll at the side of the hills. No light was visible anywhere. Alan used his pocket flash, and that guided us to the front door, which was swinging dismally back and forth on one hinge, making a doleful, creaking noise distinguishable above the wind. We did not stop to knock, feeling pretty certain the house had no occupant, or the door would be locked on a night like this. "For such shelter let us give thanks." Alan chuckled grimly, pushing me in first. He closed the door after us to shut out the rain, but it immediately swung open again. We found ourselves in a long, wide hall, which evidently divided the house through the center. At the extreme end was an old-fashioned staircase with banisters. The floors creaked and gave with the weight of our bodies as we walked, and I fancied a rat scurried across my foot. There was an odor of mustiness and damp about the place, as though it had not been occupied for years. There were no furnishings of any kind, no blinds to the windows, and most of the panes of glass were missing. But even in the dim light that Alan's spot afforded, we could see it had an old-time elegance. Probably at one time, monstrous log fires had burned in the massive brick fireplaces at the end of the two rooms opening off the separating hallway. The woodwork appeared to be of black walnut. The floors unquestionably had been highly polished, though now they were worn and earth-stained. The ceilings were falling, and the wallpaper hung in great strips from the plastering. A more uninviting place could not be imagined. I clung to Alan's arm, half afraid to venture farther. "I'm awfully cold," I whimpered through chattering teeth. "Do you suppose there's a stove in the kitchen? Maybe we can find some paper and start a fire if there is." Alan did not answer, but led the way to the back of the house. Before some swinging doors, he hesitated a second, then flung them open and entered. I followed. It was an old-fashioned brick-floored kitchen. In one corner stood a battered, rust-covered coal range. The chimney was disconnected, and part of it lay on the floor before the open oven. Piles of old rags and broken bits of twigs and newspaper filled a box near it. Alan thrust the spotlight into my hand and pounced upon the debris. In a little while, he had a fire burning in the old stove, and the kitchen was filled with sooty smoke and blessed warmth. I stripped off my soggy motor coat and flung it across the box to dry out. Alan removed his coat and did likewise. Now, if I just had a cup of coffee and a sandwich, I wouldn't be at all unhappy, I said. "Forget it," he laughed. "Nothing doing. It's a lucky thing for us this old barn is well built. If it wasn't, I could see visions of that wind lifting it off its pins and tossing it down into the cavern." I shuddered. "Let's not think about it. The car may not even be there in the morning." To kill time and to get our minds off the storm outside, I suggested that we rummage around a bit and see what the place was like upstairs. As we stepped into the long open hallway, a gust of wind whipped through the swinging door and carried with it a perfect torrent of rain that made little puddles at our feet. Fearfully, I followed Alan up the long, broad flight of stairs, feeling that uncanny something that is so often present in an old, unused house. I half expected some spectre of the past to reach out and lay clammy, unearthly hands upon me, or a shadowy something to greet us on the landing, where we paused and looked about. There were 6 doors leading off the corridor, all exactly alike. With the exception of one, they were slightly ajar. The 6th appeared to be locked. Curiosity prompted me to go toward it first. The knob turned in my hand, but the door stayed closed. "Bluebeard's den," laughed Alan. "Take care that you aren't another Anne. It's locked, obviously. I wonder why. Possibly for the same reason that all the others aren't. The owner, when he left the place, didn't take the trouble to unlock it. I twisted and turned the knob, trying to force an entrance, but the lock held in spite of its age and rustiness. Alan laughed at my efforts, then he pushed open the door to his right, which was slightly ajar. His exclamation of surprise called my attention from the bolted door. "What is it?" I gasped. "By George, Nell, look here." Chapter 2. I followed him into the room. My surprise equaled his own at what I saw. In direct contrast to the barrenness of the rooms below, this one was beautifully furnished with rich draperies covering the crumbling walls, and rugs upon the floor. The furniture was evidently new, and though a trifle gaudy, it was not without taste. A table in the center of the room, covered with a damask cloth, china, and silver, was spread as though for a meal. There was a half-emptied bottle of wine and 2 glasses. One glass still contained the liquor. Even a loaf of bread and some cold cuts and salad remained. An open lunch kit rested in a chair near the table. I looked at Alan in amazement. He gave me a glance of equal astonishment. "I don't quite understand it," he murmured. "Do you suppose it is possible that someone lives here?" I shook my head. "With the whole lower floor going to rack and ruin and overrun with rats, no, it isn't possible. Nell, this bread is soft." He lifted the loaf and thrust his finger into the crust. Then he glanced half apprehensively over his shoulder at some velvet draperies that covered the double doors. I don't know why, but I shivered. Judging from their juxtaposition, those doors led into the room that was bolted from the hallway. Alan lowered his voice as he spoke. "Someone is either in this house or has been here but a short time ago," he said. "This food is fresh. For some reason it has not been eaten." I gave a little cry, half of protest, half of fear, as he parted the draperies and drew back the heavy paneled doors behind them. Then I cried out in horror. Lying across a canopied bed was a man in evening clothes. It needed no second glance, even in the small light Alan's spot afforded, to show us he was dead. Either suicide or murder had caused his death, for on the white bosom of his shirt was a hideous red spot, and the blue satin and lace of the bedspread was stained with blood. "My God!" Alan whispered hoarsely. As if to accentuate the gruesomeness of the picture and its surroundings, a streak of lightning flashed directly upon that supine figure on the bed. The burst of thunder that followed seemed to rend the sky in two. The wind, careening madly around the house, rocked and banged the shutters of the one window. Let's try to go on," I sobbed. "This is awful. I can't stand it here like this." "It looks like murder," he muttered. Seemingly compelled against his will, he advanced toward the bed. I watched him in fascination as he let his light play upon the features of the man lying there. Then, more fearful of the shadows behind me and the blackness of the room we had left than of the dead, I crept close to him. Almost of one accord, we exclaimed, "Judge McPherson!" A tall, lean man with reddish-grey hair, a trifle long, a sandy beard, and no moustache. Keen, cruel eyes with criss-cross wrinkles about them. McPherson, in life, was a man not easily forgotten if once known, and not to be mistaken for anyone else, even in death. The man stretched out before us was unquestionably Judge McPherson. Then, too, I recognized an unusual sapphire and diamond ring on his finger, which I had admired at a dinner party not a month before. "It is murder," Alan said. "He hasn't been robbed either. I wonder if there is a telephone here." "Why?" "To call up the police, of course." "There isn't any, I'm sure of it." I was right. Though the 2 rooms we had just entered were furnished and appeared to have been recently occupied, all the others were in the same state of decay as the lower floor. There was no telephone in any of them. After a while, Alan closed the double doors and drew the velvet hangings. Then silently, dazed and horror-stricken, we retraced our steps to the kitchen. The fire we had built at least had life and a certain cheerfulness, and the horror of the thing we had discovered made it impossible for us to stay in the furnished rooms upstairs. "We can't go on tonight," he said. "With daylight, we may find a detour, but we can't risk it in the dark. We don't know how close the road is to the edge of the ravine." I could not banish the picture of the dead man lying upstairs, weltering in his own blood, amidst all the garish luxury of velvets and satin, with the uneaten meal spread so near to him. Such a short time ago he had sat at the same table with us, a genial host, though a bit sardonic in his humor. Knowing him to have been a hard, cruel administrator of justice, I never doubted for an instant that he had been murdered. "Alan," I whispered, half fearful of being overheard by ears forever deafened, "who do you suppose killed him?" He shook his head. "Any one of 100 people might desire his death. Revenge is unquestionably the motive behind it." As he spoke, his eyes widened, and I noted a quick intake of his breath. Then I saw what had caused this. My motor coat, which I had left to dry, was gone, though his still remained where he had placed it. "Someone is in this house," I cried hoarsely. "Yes, the person who killed Macpherson is still here." "What are you going to do?" I wailed as he turned abruptly and started to leave the kitchen. "Search for him," he answered grimly. "But you are unarmed. A man desperate enough to commit murder wouldn't hesitate to kill you." Then a peculiar sound came to us above the roaring of the wind and the drip of the rain. Unquestionably, it was the buzz of a motor. We ran to the window, and regardless of the drenching we received the instant it was opened, we peered out into the darkness. At first, we saw nothing. Then, darker against the dark sky, we distinguished the outline of another building, not so large as the house we were in, but beyond a doubt a big barn. "Our man is in there," said Alan. "He was in the house when we arrived, and beat it to the barn while we were upstairs. He has a car out there. That's the engine we heard. Don't go out, Alan, don't go out there." But my protests were in vain. A door opened from the kitchen to a summer porch, and a path that led to the barn. Almost before the words were out of my mouth, he darted through this door and out into the storm. There was nothing for me to do but to follow. I felt I would rather face a live murderer than stay alone in that great house with his dead victim. Before we reached the barn, a car, which by its long, low outlines was just distinguishable in the darkness, swung out into the road before us. Its lamps were unlighted, and we could not see its occupant. Alan called out commandingly, with a bravery that was foolhardy to an extreme. "Stop! Stop where you are!" The car came toward us. The engine sputtered, the machine swerved a little, as though driven by a drunken person or someone unused to handling a wheel. Alan gave his command again, then deliberately stepped into the pathway. The car came to an abrupt stop. "You can't go on tonight," Alan said. "The road is blocked, and whoever you are, you'd be a fool to attempt it in this storm." The person at the wheel did not reply, but instead swung the car around and returned to the barn. We followed. As we reached a doorway, a sudden gleam of light illuminated the passage. It came from a kerosene lantern held by a figure in a motor coat, which I recognized as my own. A small, unquestionably feminine figure. "I'll go back to the house with you," she said. "After all, what difference does it make?" The woman who stood there holding the lantern above her head was the most tragically beautiful creature I had ever seen. She did not appear to be very young, Possibly she was in her later 30s, but her small, almost childish stature gave her the appearance of extreme youth. Great dark eyes burned in a small, ashen-pale face, whose pallor was accentuated by her vivid scarlet mouth. Masses of blue-black hair tumbled about her shoulders and onto the leather collar of my coat. Evidently, the coat had been hastily donned, for it wasn't fastened and exposed to view the shimmery satin of the evening gown she wore. In a brief glance, I noted her sodden silver shoes and the mud-stained hem of her gown. The silver lace which bordered it was mud-stained and spattered with blood. A pongee cloak, which she had evidently used to motor in, lay a drenched and soggy mass on the seat of the roadster. For a strained moment, we stared at each other. The fragile, infinitely pathetic woman facing Alan and me. Then she swayed as if about to fall. I started toward her, but she straightened up bravely and gave a little laugh. It isn't very pleasant out here," she said in a musical voice. "The house is a trifle better." Silently we trudged back through the overgrown grass and weeds, our feet sinking deep into the spongy ground. Alan relieved her of the lantern and lighted us into the house. I'll return your coat to you," she said in a half-apologetic tone, going toward the stove which still glowed red and cheerful from the fire Alan had built. "I shan't need it now. I really didn't mean to steal it. I hoped to return it somehow, some way. I was desperate." As we were silent, she choked and then with an air of bravado continued, "I am sorry I cannot offer you any better hospitality, but—" A wave of a very thin white hand expressed more than words could have done. "Offer us any better hospitality?" Alan repeated dumbly after her. "Yes, this is my home, but it isn't the same as it was when I lived here. I don't quite understand," I stammered. Chapter 3. A thin white line settled about Alan's rigid mouth. I knew he was wondering what connection the beautiful pallid woman had with the dead man lying upstairs. If she had herself killed him, or if she even knew of his existence. She seemed to sense what I did, for the half-born smile on her lips faded, and the dark eyes became darker, if possible, as they widened. Her hands fluttered upward, then dropped helplessly to the side of her orchid-colored gown. "Yes," she said dully, as if in reply to a question, "I killed him. I was in the closet upstairs when you went into the other room. While you were in there, I stole out through the door I had locked on the inside and down the stairs. I took your cloak and ran out to the stable. I was going to drive away when you called me back. Perhaps it is just as well you did. It doesn't matter much one way or another." "You killed Judge McPherson," I gasped. "Why?" "You knew him very well." An enigmatical smile played about her lips, full and softly rounded like a child's. That smile held a world of wisdom and tragedy in a moment's flicker. It made her face strangely old and careworn in the light of the oil lamp. I suddenly seemed to be looking at the remnants of a once beautiful woman, at a battered and bruised soul, not at the woman herself. "I wonder just how well you knew him," she said as though to herself. "Not as well as I did, at any rate." "He was your lover?" Alan asked. We lowered our voices as if taking our cue from her. Curiously, I felt more of an interest in the woman herself than in the fact that she had killed Judge McPherson. She shook her head in reply to Alan's question, and her lips curled scornfully. After a little she said, "Would you like to have me tell you all about it?" Somehow, I feel as if I should be relieved if I did so. I'm really very unnerved and shaken. After all, it's a terrible thing to take a human life. To watch a soul leave a man's body, even though you know that man to be a reptile and deserving of more than one death. I shan't speak when I am arrested. They can do as they like with me. But I'll not have the newspapers and their ravenous readers gloating over my miserable downfall. You do not know who I am, nor do I know you. We shall never meet again, and something tells me that when morning comes you will allow me to go my way, and you will go another, so I should like you to know the truth." She was strangely calm. Only the pallid whiteness of her face and a glitter to her dark eyes showed any of the tumult seething within her. Alan and I both hung upon her words. Somehow it seemed unnecessary for us to talk. She shivered. Without a word, Alan pulled the box on which he had flung his coat nearer the fire and half assisted her to sit upon it. "Shall I go upstairs and fetch you a chair?" he said. "No, no, oh no." For one instant, she lost control of herself. The next moment she was as calm and restrained as a society matron serving tea. Alan and I seated ourselves on the floor at her feet. The thunder and lightning had ceased, and but for the steady drip-drip of the rain, the night was placid and quiet. For a long time, it seemed to my overwrought nerves that the woman sat there with her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her great eyes staring at a red glowing spot on the old stove. Once or twice, she glanced apprehensively over her shoulder, as though she expected the man she had slain to appear in the doorway behind her. "I was born here, reared here, and married in this house," she said at last. "My little boy was born here." It was a beautiful old house then. Seeing it now, you can scarcely realize what it was in those days. When I was a girl, it used to be full of young people laughing, dancing, and enjoying life. We had husking bees in the barn, Halloween parties, dances, in the winter sleigh rides and Christmas trees. Many's the time I've coasted down that long hill and landed in a heap at the bottom. Then I married a man I adored. He worshipped me. He placed me on a pedestal as something just a little more than mortal. He was an intensely religious man, perhaps a trifle austere, but because I loved society and young company, we continued to fill the home with guests. There was never a shadowy corner in the house like there is now. The lights were always bright. There were always laughing voices to be heard and music. She spoke very slowly, in an almost pedantic fashion, as though choosing her words and a bit uncertain of them. It was as though she were speaking a tongue not quite familiar to her. When my little boy was born, both my husband and I were overjoyed. Even the fact that he was a fragile little fellow did not drown our happiness. For a year we battled to keep him alive. Then he began to grow sturdy and rosy like the other children who came with their parents to visit us. About that time, my husband became very absorbed in his profession. He was compiling a historical volume of intense interest to himself. Because I was lonesome, I used to go into the city quite often to the theatre, generally to matinees, and come back at dinner time. Several times I went later in the day and remained overnight. I did not realize then that he was jealous of me, that he was suspicious. If only he had said something to me, but he never did, until too late. I was very innocent in those days. Principally because I did not wish to disturb him or impose upon my friends, the few times I remained overnight in the city, I stayed in a small hotel, walking to and from the theatre alone. Imagine my horror when, one night as I turned the corner to go to the hotel, which was in a side street, a man put his hand on my shoulder and before I could make any protest informed me I was under arrest. Too dazed and bewildered to demand the reason for this outrage, I did nothing but declare my innocence. I was dragged downtown to the police court and put upon the stand before a grinning, gaping crowd of spectators. I was asked obscene questions by that man lying upstairs, sneered at because of my protestations of virtue, then thrown in a cell with 2 drunken prostitutes and a half-insane old woman. I was so ashamed, so horror-stricken, yet so certain of my release in the morning, that I did not telephone my husband about what had happened. It never occurred to me that I would be branded as a woman of the streets and sentenced to prison. But I was. Judge Macpherson, a man of the world who should be able to distinguish between women, laughed at me, and with one wave of his smug hand, with one word sentenced me to 6 months' confinement and a lifetime of hell. Never so long as I live will I forget his face. That same night my baby was taken ill, and my husband tried to find me. His search discovered to him the fact that I was in jail for soliciting on the street. Then the jealousy, the suspicions he had felt for me burst into flame, making him ready to believe the worst of me. I never saw him but once after that. That one time he denounced me as a woman unfit to live, as a thing too vile to breathe the same air as my child. Then he told me the boy was dead. Of course he secured my release, but it was too late. When I came out of prison, I went to Judge McPherson's home. I remember he was sitting at dinner. He was very annoyed at having his meal disturbed by a pale, bedraggled, slovenly-looking woman. He was at no pains to hide his annoyance. I told him what he had done to me, an innocent woman, and I demanded that he right this wrong. There was the same smiling sneer on his face as when he sentenced me. "Just how can I do this, my dear lady?" he said. "Go to my husband," I cried wildly. I had not learned to restrain myself then. "Tell him that I am innocent, absolutely innocent. My baby is gone, but there is still a chance for me if he will take me. You must explain to him. You must make him understand." He laughed at me. "Old stuff, my dear," he sneered. "Old stuff. Why can't you women think of something original? Of course you are all innocent. None of you will even admit to a first offense. I'm sorry if your child is dead, that is, if you had one, but I certainly won't help to hoodwink a man who evidently is a person of principle. If you don't want to suffer, behave yourself, that's all I have to say. Good evening." Then he showed me the door. I think I went insane. I remember standing outside and pounding on it, screaming maledictions on him, shrieking to him that he must clear me, that he must give me back my good name. Then someone seized me, and I was dragged away to the station house again. I left it under a 6-month sentence for disorderly conduct. When I got out this time, dazed, broken, aged, I realized that nothing I could ever do or say would reinstate me. This second arrest, caused by the man who had ruined me, had branded me forever and forever. I learned my husband had divorced me, disposed of everything in our home, and sailed to France. Those who had been my friends passed me on the street without recognition. There was no one in the world I could turn to. I was practically without means. To be sure, I owned this house, but I did not have the money to keep it in repair, and I could not live in it. The memories it recalled were maddening. Then, too, I felt everyone knew my story, and I could not face their scornful glances. Time and again I was tempted to kill myself, but one thing always held me back: my undying, soul-eating hatred for the man who had passed judgment on me. One day I realized why this monstrous thing had happened to me. I was to be the instrument with which to save innumerable women from a fate similar to mine. It was to be my task to rid the world of the viper who destroyed innocence and laughed at his handiwork. I almost became happy in contemplation of what I would do. What did it matter to me that to accomplish his destruction I must accomplish my own? The thing he had branded me, I became in reality. I was beautiful. Soon I learned I was desirable, and I could be fascinating. I studied all the arts and wiles of the oldest profession in the world, and determined to sell myself to the highest bidder. My education, my knowledge of society, my culture, all stood me in good stead. Understand, I always stayed within the law. I was never crude. I took no chances of another arrest. My new name, the one I adopted when I became of the demi-monde, I kept unsmirched, if you could call it that. I became a leader in the set, where mistresses laughed at wives, and where lovers were more popular than husbands. I discovered, to my intense delight, that although austere and apparently religious, Judge McPherson's besetting sin was women, that he used the time-worn excuse of an invalid wife to cover his indiscretions. You don't know it, of course, as he kept the scandal quiet, but it was I who brought about his divorce. It took me 3 years to secure an introduction to him, but it took less than 3 hours to hopelessly ensnare him. It was not strange that in the smiling, elegantly blasé woman of the world, he did not recognize the half-crazed, bedraggled woman of the police courts. He was just at that most susceptible age, when he felt that youth was slipping from him, and old age waiting to claim him had put a taboo on affairs of the heart. With a desperate desire to remain young, he flung himself headlong into my hands, never doubting that I was what I appeared. A divorcee whose misplaced affections had made her a trifle bitter toward men, yet who was longing and looking for a loving protector. I played my cards well. I used all the coyness of the ingenue with the blandishments of the courtesan to keep him on tenterhooks before he became that protector. After that, it was easier. He did not realize why I suggested weekend parties, gradually making this house their setting. I had, from the first, determined that as this was the home he had destroyed, so here he should be destroyed. It was his money which furnished those rooms upstairs. Rather grim humor, isn't it? Can you conceive of the loathing I felt at that man's touch, how I cringed as he embraced me, how I laughed and anticipated the climax of it all? He called me a charming child with quaint ideas when he first saw this place, abandoned and decayed. The unusualness of our rendezvous appealed to him as unique. Early I learned unwholesome things intrigued him. Tonight was our third visit. We arrived just before the storm broke. As usual, we brought a lunch kit with our dinner in it. That meal was never eaten. I had drugged the wine just enough to befog his brain and make him like wax in my hands. Then, as he sat there, stupid, dazed and inert, I told him who I was and why he was here. And I laughed at him as he had laughed at me when he had me taken away, kicking and screaming, by the police. You would have laughed too had you seen his face. When I showed him the revolver and told him I was going to kill him, he cringed like a sick animal, whimpering and begging for mercy, the kind of mercy he hadn't shown me. Still I laughed. He staggered drunkenly to his feet and came toward me. I don't think he felt certain that I meant what I said. I whirled on him and backed him into the bedroom. Then, when he made a lurch toward me, trying to secure the pistol and stumbled against the bed, I fired. He fell across it dead. "Where is the pistol?" Alan asked dryly. The woman's eyes narrowed. "I flung it under the bed. His blood smeared my gown, see." After a little, I went out to drive the car to town, but it was raining so hard I became drenched before I reached the barn. I came back to the house. Then I heard you come in at the front door. I was frightened. I had fancied myself absolutely alone out here. I locked the bedroom door when I heard you climb the stairs. You know the rest. We were silent for a few moments. Then Alan said abruptly, "I'd like to take a look at him again." The woman rose slowly, and we all filed up the stairs again. At the bedroom door she laid a feverish hand on mine, and I felt a shudder go through her. But when we stood staring at the cold, dark figure before us, her face was unexpressive, emotionless. Half entangled in the lace of the bedspread where it had fallen, or been thrown, as Macpherson stumbled against the bed, was the revolver. The light from the lantern, though not brilliant, illuminated more space than Alan's spot had done, hence it had been hidden from our view before. Alan looked steadily at her for a moment. I could not read what was passing through his thoughts. Then he motioned for us to follow him downstairs. The steady drip-drip of the rain made me drowsy. We huddled in silence on the floor before the stove, the woman staring off into space. Presently I dozed, leaning against Alan's shoulder. When I awakened, it was breaking day. She was gone. "Alan," I cried, shaking him a little to wake him. "She's gone." "Yes, I know. I saw her when she left. But who are we to judge?" he asked slowly. Chapter 4. 2 days later, picking up a New York newspaper, I read the headlines. Judson McPherson, well-known justice of the criminal court, commits suicide in abandoned house in the Catskill Mountains. Then followed a half-column account of the act in detail. Macpherson, having gotten into financial difficulties, had chosen the coward's way out, so said the paper. A letter announced his intention of dying and gave the location where to find his body. The paper also stated that the knowledge he had recently married a young and beautiful actress came as a distinct surprise to his friends. A picture of his bride accompanied the article. The wistful, almost tragic face pictured was unquestionably that of the woman who said she had killed him. I stared at Alan as I handed him the newspaper. "Was she lying?" I gasped. He shook his head. "If so, she was a clever actress," he answered. "But one thing is certain, we'll never know the truth. Either way, he brought about his own death." End of The Abandoned House by Beulah Poynter. Jim Dickinson's Head by Harold Ward. First published in The Black Mask, August 1920. Jim Dickinson's head, pickled in a jar of alcohol, reposes in the dishonored fastness of a dusty closet in Dr. Wright's office. It has been all of a half-century since I assisted the doctor's father, old Doc Wright, in separating it from its trunk that dark, stormy night out in the weed-grown potter's field. Yet, last night, when I looked at the grisly relic, the face wore the same wolfish grin that it had borne in life. The fangs were skinned back ferociously like the tusks of an angry boar, and the one good eye, the other had been gouged out in a fight years before, glared malevolently, insolently, leeringly, as if, even in death, the owner found a certain grim pleasure in cheating the law, which had declared that head and body must remain intact. Jim Dickinson's body has, in the natural course of events, long been incorporated with the black earth slime from which it came. Over it, the loathsome worms have long since ceased to hold their ghoulish revelry. His filthy soul is without doubt in the hell it created for itself. As for his head, the head he lost to Doc Wright in a poker game, and which the whiskey-sodden old physic dispenser claimed from the grave rather than brave the unspeakable wrath of the dead outlaw, that is another story. Doc wanted the head because of the thickness of the skull, which had withstood, without cracking, a tattoo from the butt end of a revolver in the hands of a frenzied man. And Dickinson wanted him to have it because it had been fairly won, and the only point of honor he ever observed was the payment of his gambling debts. It is of Jim Dickinson's malformed headland, the black cat with the devil's tempers, and Creole May, the outcast, that this story is written. Chapter 1. Where Jim Dickinson was spawned or whelped, or whatever the inception of an anomaly like him can be called, is a question. My personal opinion is that he was never born, that he was created from the slimy green frog spit that gathers in a scum on stagnant muck, but the preachers will probably take issue with me on that point. At any rate, I know of my own knowledge that there were more maggots of deviltry squirming inside the blackness of his skull than could ever exist in the same space in hell. Jim Dickinson made his first bid for our attention by appearing in Black Peter's saloon one dark, stormy night. A big, hulking figure of a man with a broken hooked nose and a black tangled thatch of whiskers. His huge, misshapen head stuck out, turtle-wise on a thick bull neck. His thin, cruel lips were drawn back in a snarl of vindictive hatred of the world in general, over yellowed fangs so large as to almost appear artificial. One socket was empty. From the other blazed an orb, so badly twisted out of shape by the scar from the wound that had destroyed the other, that it looked to be almost in the center of his forehead, giving him a horrible, ogre-like appearance. There was nothing human about him. He was an animal. Black Peter's den was crowded that night. Finding no open space at the bar, Dickinson made one for himself by shooting, in cold blood, a poor Swede whose place he coveted. Before the murmur of anger and astonishment had fairly started, he stepped across his victim's twitching body to the blood-bespattered bar and downed the liquor which the latter had just poured out. His baleful eye gleamed from under his mop of hair, challenging the world to dispute his right. The Swede was a stranger in the camp, and the ferocious cruelty and simian-like appearance of the slayer was such as to make the average man think twice before taking up a dead man's quarrel. Where he had come from, no one knew, nor did his attitude towards the world at large tend to encourage familiarity. By that one venomous deed, he became the bully of the camp. From then until his death, he held his sway over the scum of the earth that had gathered there by sheer devilishness and wanton cruelties. He was a thief, a crook, a gambler, and a red-handed killer, a beast, a thing of evil. The only sense of decency he had was in the payment of his gambling debts. He would murder a man in cold blood without a pang of remorse in order to filch from his pocket the money with which to pay a debt of honor. His philosophy of life was as warped and crooked as his twisted soul, and yet we allowed him to live because we feared him. Take the affair with the gang from Devil's Gulch. Originally, there had been 6 of them pitted against him as a result of some mix-up with one of the partners. By shooting straight, Dickinson whittled the number down to 3 before they caught him at the edge of camp with a bullet through his leg and a horse that dropped dead in its tracks. He had no friends. He expected no assistance. Those of us who were at leisure gathered around to enjoy the spectacle and to see that the strangers handled the affair in a strictly ethical manner. The only tree in that part of the state was a stunted cottonwood, the lower limbs of which were but a few feet above his head as he stood erect. His gun was empty, and he was apparently exhausted. Hence, they attempted to send him into the presence of his Maker without going to the trouble of binding him, thinking, no doubt, that he would die game and save them any unnecessary trouble. They were not as well informed on the general cussedness of the man, however, as they should have been, a fact which resulted disastrously for the visitors. For Dickinson, instead of giving up the ghost without a fight, made a mighty leap and seized the lower limb with both hands, taking the strain off his neck. Doc Wright, drunker and more vitriolic than usual, was among the spectators. The dissipated old reprobate chuckled gleefully and hammered the outlaw smartly over the knuckles with his cane. "Leggo that tree," he yelled. "Why the hell can't you die like a man? You yellow dog, you're trying to cheat me out of your head." With the speed of a panther, Dickinson hung by one hand, slipped the noose over his head with the other, kicked one of his captors in the face as he hung there, and vanquished the other 2 in a fair fight, fists against gun. And when he had completed the job, he humbly apologized to Doc Wright for not allowing them to hang him, so that the bone setter could claim his honest winnings. Chapter 2. To cavemen like Jim Dickinson, love comes but once, and in ways that are peculiar and dark. That he loved Creole May in his own fashion there is not a doubt, and like his Aboriginal ancestors, he demonstrated his affection by beating the lady of his choice whenever opportunity offered, and she, recognizing, in the subtle way that women have, that his display of brutality was only a cover for the flame of love that smoldered in his heart, took her beatings, whimpering but uncomplainingly, and, seeking an outlet for her feelings, lavished her affections on Michael. Michael was an ugly brute of a cat, black of fur and short of temper. In short, a feline double of Dickinson. Dickinson hated him with a deep, jealous hatred, hated him because Creole May loved him. With the peculiarity of a woman, she treated her lord with humbleness and humility, fighting his battles and cooking his meals in a true wifely way until he laid hands on the cat. That she would not allow, and Dickinson, loving the swarthy strumpet who shared his bed and board, feared to vent his feelings on the animal, lest he drive the female creature from his side. Cheetah, the squaw, who was reputed to be a witch, had warned him against black cats, warned him as she cursed him for the killing of her husband. Dickinson sought to close her mouth by knocking her down, but she refused to be silenced. "It'll get ye, curse ye!" "It'll get ye," she howled, shaking her skinny fist at the one-eyed man. "A black cat'll be the death of ye. A black cat'll send ye to hell and'll spit at ye while you're roasting. Damn ye, ye spawn of the devil." In self-defense, he was compelled to choke her into unconsciousness, but her screams still echoed in his ears. Nor could he drown them in drink, for the maggots in his head were the kind that alcohol stimulates rather than deadens. We had our priest, Father O'Loughlin, a warm-hearted little chap who sought, with every means at his command, to regenerate the place and bring its inhabitants into the fold. He met with scant success, to say the most. But he persisted, and because he was a man among men, measured by men's standards, he gained our respect and love, even though we refused to follow the cross. In some mysterious manner, Father O'Loughlin learned that Creole May had once been baptized in his faith. Immediately, he set about seeking a way to win her back to the church, but she had slipped too far down the scale of righteousness and virtue. She gave no heed to the messages the good padre sent her, time after time, begging her presence at the little church in the valley, with its cross of spotless white. Of two evils, she had been taught to fear Jim Dickinson worse than the threat of hell, and Dickinson, his soul already forfeited to the devil, and his head honestly lost in a poker game, waiting only his death to be claimed, forbade her responding to the priest's appeal. But, to the latter, she was a brand to be plucked from the burning, and after several weeks had elapsed, he determined to visit her in person and appeal to her better nature. For Father O'Loughlin loved humanity, and to him none had dropped so low that he could not be saved. On the evening selected by Father O'Loughlin for his visit, Dickinson, who was violently jealous, having been called away on some expedition outside the law, had taken precautions tending to keep any of May's admirers away from the cabin by planting a bear trap in the dirt just outside the door. To this May submitted dumbly and without bitterness. She was a woman, and her philosophy taught her that a woman is the rightful prey of the man strong enough to take her. The method of taking did not enter into her thoughts. They lived in a tumble-down shack far up the mountainside and approached by a single narrow path, nicked high in the cliff. For Dickinson was a bit of a strategist, and in building looked forward to a possible siege following some new outrage. When she saw the little priest slowly puffing up the path, she realized for the first time that something of evil might result from Dickinson's efficient though brutal attempt to capture his rivals. She was willing to stand his abuse, but sight of the priest brought remembrances of her better days, and over her swept a sense of shame. She rebelled against the man of God, seeing her in her squalor and misery. There was no way to flee, for the path over which he was approaching was the only way from the place, and that path would bring him directly into the jaws of the trap. Creole May, for the first time in her long career of shame and sorrow, was panic-stricken. There was but one door to the shack. To dodge out of it, even in the dusk of the swiftly falling twilight, would betray her presence to the visitor, nor was there a bush or a rock in the vicinity behind which she could take refuge. Yet she could not remain. She was not given to analyzing her sentiments. She had a vague feeling that she was not fit to meet the man who represented in that wild territory the church of her innocent youth. Not for the punishment he might bring, for she knew that he brought only a message of love, but as an erring child fears the parent who governs by kindness. Physical pain she could endure, but she knew that Father O'Loughlin ruled his flock by love, and love, except the love she lavished on Michael, was missing from her strange life. So, like a child caught in some mischievous prank, she peeped around the doorway and watched the head of the priest just appearing over the little knoll. Her foot rested on the chain which, fastened to the bed and dragging across the floor, was attached to the bear trap. To leave the snare in its present location meant injury to the priest. Even if the jaws did not break his leg, Dickinson might return ere she could free him, and Dickinson, in a jealous rage, cared nothing for God, man nor devil. He might even kill the good father. In spite of her fear of Dickinson's vengeance over the removal of his snare, the religion of her girlhood surged forward in her thoughts. Father O'Loughlin must be saved. To think was to act. Hastily grasping the chain, she gave a mighty heave and pulled the trap out of the dirt and dragged it into the house. Pulling down the blanket on the battered bed, she laid the trap on the mattress and laid the covering over it again. Then she dived hastily under the bed, just as she heard the priest's step outside the door. Father O'Loughlin, receiving no answer to his repeated rappings, turned sadly and wended his way back again down the mountain path. With fear and trembling, Creole May listened to the Padre's retreating footsteps. Then, as they died away in the distance, she arose and, seating herself in one of the 2 broken chairs the cabin afforded, she gave way to meditation and tears, sharing her troubles with Black Michael, her only friend. Dickinson, returning earlier than usual, found the cabin in darkness and May in tears. The moon, shining brightly on the front of the shack, showed him that the trap had been removed ere he reached the spot. With a bellow of rage, he leaped through the open doorway. He stood for a second, his single bloodshot eye accustoming itself to the darkness of the interior. Then, with a snarl, he turned upon the woman. "Where is he?" he demanded, shaking her as a terrier shakes a rat. "Damn you, tell me, where's the man you had in here?" She attempted to answer, to explain. He refused to listen. The words were choked off in her throat by the pressure of his huge muscular fingers. Then, holding her at arm's length with his left hand, he smashed blow after blow into her face with his right until, tiring, he hurled her into the corner, a dying, battered, unconscious heap. The cat, true to its nature, spit angrily at the invader. Roaring like a maddened bull, Dickinson aimed a kick at the animal. Michael, attempting to dodge out of the crazed man's way, became tangled between his legs. In the darkness, Dickinson stumbled and fell, sprawling, across the bed. His huge head struck the trigger of the bear trap hidden beneath the blanket, squarely and with the force of a battering ram. The jaws flew together with a snap, closing about the thick neck with a grip that had been made to hold a grizzly king. Dickinson threshed about spasmodically for a second, his eye bulging out of its socket. His finger worked convulsively. Then, twitching slightly, he lay quiet. On the foot of the bed, Michael, his greenish-yellow eyes gleaming like twin fires, humped his back and spit in accordance with the prophecy of Cheetah. While Jim Dickinson's worthless soul entered into hell, 2 nights later I helped Doc Wright claim the head he had won, and which Jim Dickinson was ready to pay. End of Jim Dickinson's Head by Harold Ward. The Face That Stared Back at Blaisdell by Edwin Carty Rank. First published in The Black Mask, August 1920. These are the facts in Blaisdell's queer case, taken from a communication addressed to his best friend, Dr. Maynard Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton vouchsafes no explanation, nor do I. Indeed, there are phenomena in this old world that cannot be explained, as Hamlet pointed out to Horatio in a much-quoted speech. The statements given here were contained in a carefully written paper in Blaisdell's handwriting, which was found in Blaisdell's desk by Dr. Hamilton several days after the man's death. From this paper, he has pieced together the extraordinary narrative that follows. Chapter 1. Blaisdell thinks it must have been shortly after midnight that he fell asleep. Horrible nightmares racked him as he tossed upon his bed, and one of them was so frightful that he woke up with a scream, or thought he did. At any rate, he suddenly found himself in the center of his bedchamber, dressing with feverish haste. And here is the queer part of the narrative, for he affirms that, While he was dressing, another man lay in his bed, an exact counterpart of himself. This other ego lay quietly asleep, his head on his arm. Blaisdell studied him carefully and said he felt as a locust must feel when he looks at his outworn shell. All the time he was dressing, Blaisdell says he seemed to be impelled to haste by queer promptings that were as insistent as if some person were at his elbow saying, "Hurry, hurry." He finished his dressing in mad excitement and then hurried out of the room, casting a backward glance over his shoulder at his sleeping counterpart. Once outside his apartment house in Gramercy Park, Blaisdell hurried along, his persistent mentor seeming to walk at his elbow. A puzzling feature of this nocturnal prowl was that he felt a sense of familiarity, a feeling that he was on his way to keep an appointment that could not be postponed. The streets were deserted except for an occasional prowler, or a patrolman who made the night echo with sharp blows from his club, as he struck a metal post occasionally to remind the unlawful that the law was abroad. On, hurried Blaisdell. By this time, he had lost all sense of location, but he was aware that he was in a downtown section of New York, a section that he had never visited during his waking moments. But, although he knew that he had never been in this neighborhood during his conscious moments, he felt that he was on familiar territory. Finally, he paused in front of an old, 3-story brownstone front residence in Washington Square, paused with the air of one who has reached his destination. He walked up the steps and let himself into the house with a pass key. Nor did it seem strange to him that he had a pass key for a house that he had never visited during his waking moments. It all seemed ordinary and commonplace. Blaisdell quietly mounted the stairs until he reached the second floor, and there he paused before a closed door, overcome by a suffocating sense of fear and repugnance. He half turned away, and then retraced his steps as if fascinated. Something seemed to warn him away from that ominous door, behind which lay a mystery that the everyday Blaisdell, millionaire and bon vivant, did not care to penetrate, but which this nocturnal, prowling Blaisdell seemed to insist upon. Then, without any conscious volition on his part, Blaisdell placed his hand on the knob, and the door opened noiselessly. He found himself in a large, square living room, tastefully furnished and lined with built-in bookcases full of handsomely bound volumes. Everywhere he looked, he saw bizarre weapons of defense, and men in Chinese and Japanese armor looked threateningly at him from dim corners of the room. It was either the apartment of an art connoisseur or a globetrotter with a propensity for the unusual. From this room, he stepped into a bedchamber and then started back with a little gasp. It was a luxuriously furnished room that appeared to have been transplanted by Aladdin's wonderful lamp straight from the perfume-scented Orient. Blaisdell advanced further into the room, and his feet sank into a wonderful moss-like carpet. To one side of the room was an old-fashioned 4-poster bed, topped by a crimson canopy. In the exact center of this bed lay a man asleep, with his mouth open. There was something strangely familiar about the sleeper, and Blaisdell drew closer and gazed at him steadily. He was an oldish man with a sallow complexion and a wisp of a beard that was slightly tinged with grey. The ghost of a smile lingered upon his lips, a cruel smile that sleep could not make gentle nor mirthful. And as he gazed upon the sleeper, rage grew in Blaisdell's heart, a rage so furious that it almost suffocated him. Without a moment's hesitation, he seized the sleeper by the throat and began throttling him. The man struggled furiously. His eyes popped open and gazed up into Blaisdell's with a look of freezing despair. A slight froth gathered upon his purpling lips, and he squirmed and writhed like a snake in Blaisdell's unrelenting grasp. God, how he struggled! Blaisdell's fingers sank into the throat as if it were satin, and then suddenly there were no more struggles. The body fell back inertly as the steel-like fingers relaxed. Blaisdell pulled the bedclothes over the mask of horror and stole quietly from the room. He felt that his errand had been accomplished, As he went back over the route that he had just pursued, he felt again that weird sense of unfamiliarity that had at first possessed him, and this feeling of strangeness increased as he neared his own apartment house. He walked in and hurried past the sleeping hall boy without waking him. Once inside his apartment, he rushed into the bedroom, but his counterpart was gone. Blaisdell undressed with trembling fingers, but his head had scarcely touched the pillow before he was sound asleep. Chapter 2. A shaft of sunlight fell across Blaisdell's face, and he awoke with a shudder. "Ugh! What a horrible nightmare," he said aloud. "I feel as if I actually did kill that man." Then he yawned and rang for his valet. After a casual breakfast, he was glancing through the newspaper when he received the shock that changed him from a careless clubman into a nervous wreck. "Queer murder in Washington Square." That was the headline he read, and then followed an account of the crime. A private policeman, while going his rounds, had found the front door of an old brownstone residence open and had investigated. On the second floor, he had found another door ajar, and going in, had found a man lying in a queer bed that was overhung by a red canopy. He was about to steal quietly out, when something in the huddled attitude of the sleeper attracted his attention, and he then discovered that the man had been strangled, the marks of fingers being plainly visible upon his throat. The police investigation had established the fact that the man's name was Stephen R. Rollins, a famous traveler and authority on spiritualism. He had lived for years in the Orient, and a monograph of his on occult phenomena had attracted much attention in scientific circles. "My God," said Blaisdell as the paper fell from his trembling hands. "My God, did I go to that man's apartment while I was in the grip of that nightmare and murder him? Did I?" These questions nearly drove him frantic. What should he do? What course of action was there for him to pursue? If he went to the police and told them that he, Heilman Blaisdell, descendant of a fine old New York family, had gone forth into the night and killed a man he had never seen before, in his sleep, what would they think of him? They would probably shrug their shoulders and advise him to consult an alienist. And yet this man, this Stephen R. Rollins, was dead, and his description, and that of his apartment, coincided in every detail with the place that Blaisdell had visited in his dream. But was it a dream, and who was the other man that lay in his bed as he went out? These questions revolved in his mind like a vicious circle, almost driving him insane. Blaisdell aged after that. He looked 10 years older, and his friends were alarmed about him. Dr. Hamilton advised a change of environment and rigorous physical exercise. Otherwise, he would not be responsible for the consequences. The man jumped at every sound and had a mortal terror of the night. He would put off going to bed until the latest possible moment, and then always slept with a light in his room. Sometimes his valet would come quavering to his bedside in the night, frightened out of his wits by frightful screams from Blaisdell. "I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I couldn't have done it," he would scream, his eyes staring. "The thing is impossible. The thing is impossible." When these spells were upon him, he would shake, and it would finally be necessary for his valet to give him a sleeping powder. These things became noised abroad, and he resigned from his clubs, went nowhere, and declined all invitations. He was a broken man, a hopeless hypochondriac, just a morbid victim of nerves or drink, said his friends, and dropped him. Things went on like this for months, and then one day Blaisdell read another item in a newspaper that dumbfounded him. It detailed the arrest of a man named Franklin Sears, who was charged with the murder of Stephen R. Rollins. But he couldn't have murdered him. "I murdered him in my sleep," mumbled Blaisdell. That afternoon, one of the sensational newspapers published a picture of Franklin Sears, and Blaisdell cried aloud in new fright. His valet found him with the newspaper in his hand, mouthing and trembling, his nerves vibrating like a taut piano wire. for the face that stared back at Blaisdell from the front page was his own face. Yet Franklin Sears' name was under it. Chapter 4. Later, Sears confessed to the murder. He told the police that he and Rollins had been chums and college mates. Rollins had fallen madly in love with Sears' beautiful sister and had persuaded her to go away with him under promise of marriage. They had gone to South America, where Rollins had amassed a fortune and had then visited the Orient. She begged Rollins to make her his wife, but he refused and finally deserted her. A serious illness followed, and she sent for her brother, who promised her that he would not rest until her betrayer had been brought to book. She died, assured that he would avenge her, and he had kept his word, although he had to trail Rollins all over the world before he finally ran him down in Washington Square. Blaisdell followed the developments in the Sears case with absorbed attention. He read the newspapers feverishly and finally decided that he could stand the suspense no longer. He determined to go to the Tombs, confront his counterpart, and tell him the story of the nightmare. Surely there was an explanation of it all. There must be an explanation. He had decided to visit Sears the next day when the last queer thing happened in the tragic series of happenings. On the morning of Blaisdell's intended visit, Dr. Hamilton read in his morning paper that Franklin Sears, the murderer of Stephen R. Rollins, had committed suicide in the Tombs by hanging himself to one of the bars by his suspenders. The paper commented upon the somewhat unusual fact that the prisoner's watch was found on his body and that it had stopped at 3 o'clock. It was just a few minutes past 3 when the body was discovered, still warm. Dr. Hamilton had scarcely finished reading this account when his telephone bell rang. The excited voice of Blaisdell's valet asked him to come at once to his master's apartment, as something terrible had happened. He responded at once, and when he was ushered into Blaisdell's bedroom by the white-faced valet, he saw at once that he could do nothing further for his friend. Blaisdell was dead, and it was very evident from the stiffness of his body that he had been dead for many hours. "It ain't his being dead that's so terrible," said the trembling valet. Well, look there." He pointed to the throat of the dead man. There was the distinct mark of a rope upon it, and this mark extended clear around his neck. He couldn't have hung himself," quavered the valet, "because I was the first person who saw him, and there ain't any rope." Some unaccountable impulse made Dr. Hamilton pick up Blaisdell's watch from the dresser. It had stopped running, the hands recording the hour of 3 o'clock. End of The Face That Stared Back at Blaisdell by Edwin Carty Rank.